desire. You have the appetitive soul, the spiritual, and then the rational soul in Plato. And these three parts of the soul somewhat correspond to classes and to social conflicts in the Republic. And the goal of justice is to try to harmonize the forces in the soul, or the elements in the individual soul, with the social forces in the Republic. So the rational belongs to the philosopher, because the philosopher is the only one that can do this, issue forms, right? Talk about, I'm going to fill this in. Mm-hmm. But anyway, the philosopher is good at the issuing of forms. You issue something, you begin to deal with abstraction, right? And levels of abstraction. Whereas at the spiritual, or at the level what Badiou calls affect, taking the modern psychological theories into account, psychology theories, and also psychoanalytic theory of affect, it's really about more and more recognition, right? But not ultimately the ability to really issue the form itself dialectically. I'll talk more about this. Whereas the appetitive soul belongs to the farmers, the real producers, and the craftspeople, the makers, right? Yeah. And then, of course, you have the subculture, of course, the slaves, the slavery at that time, right? That helps build the Parthenon, etc., the manual laborers, if you will, and those who were used, right, in terms of non-citizenship during that time. And Aristotle has very good things on slave and citizen. So this is always crossing into the political as well, right? So Plato works like very much tripartite triads, if you will, in terms of three parts of the soul, three classes, the myth of the metals, the gold, the silver, and the bronze, right? Bronze is not supposed to be mixing with gold. Or gold's really not supposed to be mixing with bronze. I'm sure bronze would like to mix with gold, given the economic, arrangements at that time. And of course, this is where the medals come from in the Olympics. We get the gold is the best, silver is second runner-up. Tommy Smith, John Carlos, Black Power. Etc. I forgot who got bronze that year.
The Australian.
The Australian guy.
Yeah.
Right,
who also supported
penal colony. Yeah. With penal colony. Right. That's good. Yeah. And so anyway, keep this in mind too. So let me fill this in a little bit. So again, as I said, for Plato, it's obviously the utopia to come, or Atlantis. Some people have said the myth of Atlantis is where he's trying to go to recapture this ideal system and ideal, city-state, etc. So from the cave, right, to the good or to the true idea, right? So one source of perception is obviously the sun, right? Our solar system in Heideggerian terms, right, in some ways, right, as the governor of the visible world, right? In some ways, we can call this the sensible world. So early on, we have the sun that governs this. Okay? The other, if you cross the line, it becomes abstract. It's the good that governs.
Oh, shit.
The invisible world, if you will, or the world of the intellect. So this requires moving across the line, if you will, to get to the levels of abstraction into the world. So you have very early on in the history of Western philosophy a distinction between the sensible and the visible, right? Or the world of sensory perception versus that of intellectual seizing or perception. Okay, number one. So these are sources, right? And this ultimately becomes known as the world of appearance. And for some level, you could say Heidegger when he talks about presencing, in a way, is trying to go beyond the world of, the Anwesen, right? To go beyond the world of appearance, right? Into the world of the intellect. But also this world of appearance governed by the sun can also be thought of somewhat as the positivic world of objectivity, right? When we were talking about the Vorhanden, the things present to hand, right? This world of scientific objectivity, of which the stuff epistemology is made of, right? Modern epistemology. And you can put a whole cast of characters in here too. I'm simplifying to a degree, but not really. I want to make that kind of clear. In some ways, people such as John Dewey, The Quest for Certainty, and the Scientific Project, who's a very smart person, the pragmatist. But on the other hand, falls, at least in Heideggerian terms, to, the lack of, being able to see the ready to hand versus the ready present to hand, right? That he's still trapped within the world of objectivity and cannot go to the next level of being, right? Is unable to do so. Right?
Totally.
Right? Because the subject-object is still working here, right? In some ways, okay? So anyway, and then this becomes the world of reality, right? What we take as the reality that is governed by abstraction, the good. Now, most of you know that Marx, in terms of making, right, thinks that the world, labor itself, is sensuous activity. That's taken away in terms of processes of alienation, but it's the sensuous activity of the laborer that we need to work with. So in some ways, Marx is inverting this, that the reality is somewhat sensuous rationality. So there's an inverted Platonism going on in Marx through Feuerbach. This is a materialist, sensuous rationality moment, right? And Marcuse is part of that as well. It's not a Platonist, right, in this way. But I'm doing this for a reason. I want to just show you that there's a lot of levels of complication here. I don't mean to confuse, but just so that we, keep thinking, so to speak, right? Right? So, anyway, in the cave, right, down here below B are the images, the world of images of physical objects. And again, for Heidegger, the objects are important, the object, right, still important in the level of objectivity. This is a question of language, right? Right, in many ways, the images of physical objects. And this is the world of shadows, reflections, and illusions. For Freud, this is basically where religion is. Such a book like the metapsychological work, The Future of an Illusion, right? And you can see this in the old, this came up yesterday, the second commandment, right? Thou shalt have no images greater than me, right? In many ways, yeah?
It's also the arts.
And the arts, of course, yes. That the artists themselves are working in illusions and reflections and shadows. Now, Nietzsche considers art to be the master illusion. So, in a way, the artist is still working in this world, according to Plato, in this world of illusion, right? In the cave, right? Okay, the next level, as you go above B, is the actual physical objects themselves. So the artist that uses pipe in his sculpture, or certain forms of metal, etc. The physical objects. And this becomes all objects perceptive by the senses. So this is the senses themselves, right? To the senses. The senses themselves. So you have the physical object, you have the images, and then the physical objects right in here. And one is above B, right? The furthest down you are images, then the actual physical objects that are perceptible to your sensory objects, right? Okay? So when you cross the line, the mathematical objects And I would say out of most number is here too. Can't do mathematics without number, right? And that's where the birth of the word arithmetic is. But in this, you're basically beginning to build hypotheses. And you can begin to see, I think, in some ways, Badiou at work, that the communist hypothesis requires, right, in some ways, mathematical objects or mathematical objects through hypotheses, right? And this is one of the reasons he moves the way towards the mathematical ontology, that you can get into the world of reality, because his thing is that on the way to the true good, on the way, if you think of this as a process, and I've not read his third ontology, I really haven't read his second that carefully. I've glanced at it, Logics of World, but I would suspect, given the projection, if you will, that he's trying to get to true idea, but on the way to that is the democratic materialism. You know, he wants to be, you know, and whatever that means in Plato. I mean, I'm trying to broaden this. Badiou, Heidegger, you know, back to, you know, the source, right? Okay, so the next level, after you get the hypothesis, are the actual forms, right? And these are very abstract, right? The issue of the forms, and this becomes reality. As I said, the fundamental question of the Republic, justice, what is justice? Beauty, what is truth? The doctrine of the truth in Plato, Aristotle, etc., right? Material world itself could be considered part of that as well. So you have this going on between C and D again, right? One, you're moving up from the mathematical objects to the notion of hypothetical reasoning, right? No longer do you touch by the senses, no longer is it visible to you, right? Etc. And I recommend, if you're interested in the arts and you're interested in this kind of stuff, in the art of seeing, if you will, generally speaking, or the art of perception, then Merleau-Ponty's great notes, they're notes, like notes on a note on being in time. You know, the visible and the invisible is certainly worth reading, yeah? Because he's taking the best of Husserl and Heidegger to try to get to the things themselves again. Once again, can I turn down the heat? Is that okay? Are we warm enough now?
Oh, yeah.
You're okay or no?
Cooking over here.
I'm perfectly comfortable, but you can turn it down a little.
Sweating. I'm breaking a sweat.
Oh, no, this is a story of my marriage.
Breaking a sweat? You know, I had to get that in. I mean, since this is about the playfulness of language, right? Forget the content. I don't know how to open this. Here we go. Okay. So I'm going to put it on. It's on low already. I'm just going to turn it off just for a minute. Yeah. Whoops. It goes to off. It goes to high. Okay. All right. All right. So we'll see. If it gets too cold, we'll put it back on. All right. So going on now to modes, right? So the mode, right? Where do you begin as a mode here? Is basically the imagination. And imagination, at least for Plato, is based on supposition. Let us suppose something is the case, right? The supposition, right? Right? So this is based on supposition, right? Etc. What happens in the mode is then you get to the level of belief, right? In the second tier of this, right? And in this, you begin to accept the sensory objects as given, right? So there's an acceptance okay? To accept the chair for being a chair, right, as a given. You're not really going to go much further to the constitutive elements of it and how it's then dialectically interrelated to its building, etc. Okay? So belief, etc. is going on here. And then we get to the next level. We're going to get to the level, and we've seen this in Heidegger. Again, I love this word, Verstehen, as taking control, the understanding, right? In Plato, the understanding is in mathematical thought, closer to Badiou. right? And then here is we get the first use of the word, really outside of Heraclitus and some of the pre-Socratics, dialectic. This is where dialectic begins, right? Where reason, right, starts to operate. Dialectic as reason. And for Plato, it's the art of conversation, the art of, moving forward in a discussion, etc. But also understanding how such things like this, you get to these concepts. What is justice? Yeah. So this goes through many levels of Socratic electus, refutation, negation, right? Irony, appeals to ignorance. All these levels are part of the elements of early dialectical thinking. Okay? This is Platonic dialectic, not Marxian or Hegelian, but it's early dialectics as you go through. Adorno did some stuff with this. I know that Stanley kind of lost over that. So, that's okay. But at least you get a background here somewhat on this. The dialectics goes back. The father of dialectics, in my view, is Heraclitus. War or strife is the father of all things. Without strife, you have no things, no emergence. Without strife. And this is taken up with one of Freud's favorite pre-Socratic thinkers, Empedocles. Love and strife are at the bottom of everything. Eros and aggression. Kind of interesting, Freud's relationship to the pre-Socratics. Very little's been written about this. There's some. Empedocles. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you've heard of him, right?
Yeah, I mispronounced it. It's
Yeah.
Empedocles or something.
Okay. Yeah. So, basically, we have another thing that's going on here. In the classes of perception, down here it's called Doxa, and there are people who actually write doxographies. You know what a doxography is? It's a history of opinions. Flaubert being one of the great ones, the history of received opinions in the 19th century, Gustave Flaubert wrote a very interesting book. I've taken a look, it's very funny how people come to think a certain way. Very funny. So opinion, the world of opinion, right, is down here as a class of perception. You're perceiving through your opinions, could be the proposition, the statement that one would use in this. And then the other, of course, is going to be through knowledge, or episteme, from which the epistemological comes from. Episteme, knowledge, right? So there's no knowledge unless you've made the turn from the illusions of the cave, right? The illusions, or the bondage, if you will, better put, of the illusions of the cave to what I would call the freedom of reason in the Platonic sense, right? The freedom of reason. So the reason is liberating here, okay? Then, of course, the question that we can raise once again is what happens, is this legible? It's pretty legible, huh? You can see it, Sean? It's okay? All right. So, So you have, again, the source, the things themselves perceived, the modes, how the modes operate, right? And then how you classify that level of perception, right? So you have a four, vertical axis, you read it, and then you read it horizontally, you begin to see this model at work, right? And think of the cave, the long passageway up to the light. One of the great painterly representations of this is David's The Death of Socrates. He shows Socrates' wife leaving the vestibule of the cave, where Socrates is in the cave on the bed. It's really the prison, but, and he's pointing up, and, it's a very interesting thing, the play of light that he uses there, and, and the symmetry that it's involved, too, is the neoclassical school. So, anyway, to go back here, so again, read it from the bondage, right, if you will, of the illusions that are generated in the cage, pretty much where we live, by media, by dominant, hegemony. You can see where the hegemony of the image, etc., comes from. Debord, the commodification of the image, is certainly looking at this. You can think of the cave also as your original movie theater, projections on the wall. So this is a theory of also projection and perception, right? That's happening early on. Who controls the camera? Well, during the Jesuits, it's the Catholic Church. They control the camera in education. They control the camera position, right, etc. Yeah, no accident that D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation plays to thousands of people at RKO theaters, right? In a sense, this was a miseducation. Again, no accident that Carter Woodson writes the miseducation of the Negro at that time, or
Eisenstein,
Du Bois,
the opposite.
and
The
Reich
revolution
Fall,
is
the triumph of the
popularized,
will,
yeah.
right? In a
Yeah.
way, which is taking place here through image, right? Voice and image, marching, etc. Belief. Sensory objects always, right? No levels of abstraction to understand what he's really saying in Mein Kampf about the worker, what he's really saying about the state, right? Where they're really going, right? So this becomes a kind of a theory also, at least to my mind, as a beginning, of mass psychology. This is really it. And that then the desire question is posed too. Why do the masses want us to continue to vote against their self-interest? Why do they also desire to remain enslaved, right? Thinking that it's, okay. What is this tranquilizing nature here of habit and habitus, right? In all these notions, right? Why is it so difficult to begin the turnaround, which is basically, you're really literally turning around here, outside. You're turning full, half 180 degrees to be able to get to this level of mathematical understanding, hypothetical thinking. I mean, you can do things with this. It doesn't have to be only the mathematical, right? How do you get to these levels of understanding? Now remember, look, again, to put it in a historical context, Plato is also responding to Pythagoras, right? The Pythagoreans, are really part of the moment in terms of a contending school with the academy, and at the academy, let no one enter here who does not know the spirit of geometry. So these are battles that are actually going on materially in the historical thing. I'm being historicist here, not Heideggerian.
Where does logic fit into this in the ancient Greek, like Plato and Aristotle? So do they distinguish between math and sort of the mathematical?
No, they
and
don't
the
really
logical?
distinguish. That's more in the Pythagorean. And the Pythagoreans have two basic schools. They have, and this is interesting, the musical and then the mathematical. And one are called the acousta, from acoustics, right? Of which acoustics come from, and écouter in the French, right? What is audible? All of this is from this language of the acoustamai. The other one are the ones that go the way of the mathematikai logoi, the mathematical logic. So this is the Pythagorean school that is developing, which is well before Plato, and Aristotle.
So where does Aristotle's organon and the syllogisms fall? They fall under in Plato's system.
That's more. Well, Plato's is not reading
no room for
Aristotle.
that. Yeah.
No, but he's not even reading Aristotle.
Yeah.
Remember, Aristotle is a pupil of comes after Plato.
But
Is a
where
pupil
would
of
we place in
Plato.
Aristotle's sort of metaphysics, and that would be sort of the level of thinking and reason, right? The syllogisms are part of that.
Well, the metaphysics is looking for causes, right? I mean, this is the first cause, right? So the metaphysics is born out of there are basically four causes in Aristotle about how things work, and you have to think of this as a kind of interrelated causality. So there's first of all the material cause. Think of the making of the violin, which is always a good example. The material wood, right? It takes the form of the violin, the formal cause. Then there's the cause of the efficient, right? What is it good for? What is its use, value in the world? To give pleasure to the ears. And then teleological, what is its objective ultimately, right? To have someone both, play to the society and make a living, etc. What is the goal? The teleology, right? In a sense. So then Aristotle is asked, well, how do all these causes interrelate without something moving them? What is it? Just this progression? And he had to come up with what he calls the prime mover,
Which influenced the Jesuits.
tremendously. tremendously. The Jesuits took out the prime mover as here we go with God, right? The big kahuna that moves everything, right? The orbit of the planets, where the prime mover, right? Who's moving all of this? So this becomes a very active concept in the history of philosophy, but it's articulated as early as, about I'd say about 350 BCE. Aristotle's run out of town. He has to go to Macedonia because he didn't want to suffer the same fate as Socrates.
Oh,
he
he could have.
he could have gone to trial and been, destroyed. Yeah.
I heard that he wore like rings and he had long hair and he was like kind of vain.
Well, that's
Aristotle.
Rembrandt's version of him.
He wasn't a citizen, so he
Yeah,
could never
yeah.
sleep inside
Yeah,
Athens.
he was in
had
really
to sleep
good
on the
shape.
outside.
Yeah, he was in good shape. Yeah.
He wasn't from Athens. He was a foreigner.
No, he was. That's right.
That bothered him.
Yes. Well, you were the word barbarian comes from barbaros,
People who
which
are not,
literally means you do not speak Greek.
Yeah, but he was Greek, right? Or
Yeah, he spoke Greek.
But from
He
a
wasn't
minor-
a barbarian,
minor
minor civilization, right? The Athenians were very snobbish, to say the least. And the Macedonians, when they conquered the Athenians, even, yeah. So
But
there's
they
a
didn't
lot of
speak Greek,
historical
though. The
stuff
Macedonians
going
didn't
on
speak
here.
Greek, though.
I mean,
in the beginning.
no, they didn't.
That's the
No,
problem
no.
for the current argument.
Yes. However, Aristotle was the tutor to Alexander for a little
Alexander,
while. For a little while, not as
Yeah.
much as people think. History's shown a different Aristotle relation, Aristotelian relation. Although the great thing about Alexander the Great is he built libraries and he kept the Hellenic culture going. I mean, it went through obviously many transformations, including the Byzantine epoch, and and then of course the Ottoman, overtaking of it, right? And then it's kind of reinvention. Modern Greece is an invention of Germany, in my opinion. Yeah, partially England, but mostly Germany. That's what it is. When Goethe's Faust's first desire is give me the face that launched the 1,000 ships, his first desire is Helen of Troy. That tells you a lot about the ancient models that are being used during this time. Yeah, very, very, very interesting, right? And of course, the English Romantic poets. So the return to Greece, right, was not just the Renaissance, the Greco-Roman world, but really, and Burckhardt, of course, doesn't invent the term Renaissance until the 19th century. Nietzsche's very good friend, the historian and art historian, Jakob Burckhardt, invented the term Renaissance, right? Which was a kind of rebirth of the classical, the ancients, right, in a sense. But it's really in the 19th century, that you begin to see modern Greece, and Greece, rebels, against the Turks, of which, one of my relatives fought in Tripoli, and has a statue of him in one of the museums near Constitution Square. But anyway, the 1830s and 40s, with this fight against the Ottoman Empire, that kind of gave modern Greece its moment. Right? Now, of course, modern Greece still then had this idiotic Orthodox Church. I'm sorry to say this, but anyway, yeah. And they kept Constantinople as a still today they call Istanbul, that little area, Constantinople, from the King Constantine. Of course, they're tracing back their roots
though the
to
Ottomans have been
Byzantium.
there for 600
Yeah, and
the
also
Greeks
the
are
split
Ottomans. They're
and the
part of
split,
the
of course,
Ottomans'
and then the split, of course, from the Catholic Church over the Nicene Creed, right, in the 3rd century A.D., right, or after the death of Christ, or however. I just say, so many years into the post, to the beginning of the Roman Empire. It's more dated from Caesar forward, right? So so you have these inventions going on too, and Heidegger, Marx, Nietzsche. Obviously Goethe, all these people, Freud, they're all educated under these models, and this is actually part of the debate, which Derrida does, I think, very effectively. Foucault in a different way. I think Derrida is very intelligent in terms of looking at regimes of writing, right? As does Foucault, in terms of, I think, more historically in Foucault's case, but how do these regimes of writing play out, right, in terms of domination, right? And how do you basically ultimately undo the dominance of the Western metaphysical tradition? It becomes a kind of decolonizing activity, right? This is what he's doing as the Algerian Jew, right? In many ways, a double outsider, right? In some ways, right? Both to the French system and as the Jew, as the nomadic, right? As the stateless ones, right? So to speak. Even though they did have, you go back and you read the King David and Solomon, you see they're very much statist people here. And then you see 1948, you even get a bigger taste of that, unfortunately, what's going on today over there. But anyway, yeah. So, yeah. So really, in a sense, Derrida is undoing, this kind of dominance, but still knows that you have not gotten out. Heidegger knows this again, going back to this whole first principles, right, of Aristotle, the metaphysics, right, and how that's become to be known. They're going back to say we have to work through this and we have to constantly undo it. We have to constantly undo it. So one way of undoing it is first to understand it, right? Unfortunately, everybody attacks, to get jobs in academia. I'm just going to write a paper about this. I'm going to use the jargon. It's only jargon without the understanding. This is really part of the problem we're facing with this kind of thinking today, or non-thinking, right? It poses as, scholar shit, as Marcuse used to say. Yeah, David, I'm sorry.
Before we get off.
Yeah, sure.
Getting off Aristotle, you said there were 4 causes.
Yeah, the material, the formal, the efficient, and the teleological.
Oh, the formal is number 2.
Yeah, number 2. How something takes form from the materiality. For Plato, it's the idea, right? You have the idea of the bed, right? Then maybe the bed will material. For Aristotle, you've got to have the form for it to be a bed, just not the idea. So he's taking on idealism in a very early way with the materiality of, what we work with in some ways. Not that Plato doesn't realize this, but again, the theory of the good here is an idea. This is really all processes, and this is where Husserl, people say that Husserl is basically a new form of Platonism, that you're really producing new idealities in thought. You're not really producing materiality, right? So this is the one thing that, was going on.
Like
and one
said,
of the best books about this, is Tron Vactau's great masterpiece, Phenomenology and Dialectical Materialism. Which Derrida studied, and I think profoundly changed him. If there's one book in philosophy that he was reading that changed him, kind of gave him an impotence, it was this book. He actually
He only wrote one
says
book, The Scholar.
Tron Vactau, he wrote other things, but Phenomenology and Dialectical
Did he go
Materialism, the book he did, they tortured him.
How do you spell that?
Tron Vactau.
They tortured.
Why?
They did.
So stupid.
He was the
That's what they
Secretary
did
of
with people in
Agriculture.
those days.
Oh, he was.
He was the Secretary of Agriculture for
if
a
you're a
while.
heretic.
And then he went back, and yes, he went through all kinds of things in the 60s and early 70s. With
He wasn't welcomed as a great
No, not
Marxist
as a great
thinker.
French Marxist.
Oh.
Right, yeah. No. This is what Bolivar told me about Cuba. He said once, I remember this little short discussion we had. He was invited by to give lectures on dialectics in Havana, and he said they were so far behind. He couldn't believe it, how reductionistic they were, So in some ways, a Tron Vactau is, an outsider who's speaking almost a completely different language. So Derrida would, once the, quote, Soviet Union was opened up, right, he would say, they were very happy to get phenomenology and all these things in their philosophy departments. This is what he said, about them.
There's an
But
interesting,
go ahead with
an interesting subplot there.
So the
with-
production of idealities is the claim against that you're creating new philosophical idealities and not materialities through transcendental phenomenology, because you're constituting objects through ideas, right? Than really through their materiality in the world, right? But go ahead, what were you going to say?
No, but just about Aristotle,
Yeah.
the notion of the good. I was reading the Politics, with my class, and it's very dynamic. It is a process. How do you
Yes,
unfold
of
your
course.
full potential as a human?
Yes.
Essentially, that's the good.
Well-
That's the movement towards the good.
The good in Aristotle, the good life and all of this, and this is a great term in Greek, which we have forgotten, eudaimonia, which really means having well-being of the daemon, which is your potential, etc. When Heidegger says possibility, and he'll keep emphasizing this, I'm sure you're picking up on this as you read, Heidegger is always talking about possibility and anticipation, always the future here. That the eudaimonia is the daemon, is your inner dynamism. Your for lack of a better term, in Heideggerian terms, your historical fate and historical destiny, in some ways, right? That you must take up, right? So this is somewhat coming out of Greek tragedy. That the Greek tragedy itself is that they accept their fates, right? Right? That this is where you begin to get a notion of something, active and whatever. Now, what you're referring to is the dynamis, the dynamic, the actual, and the possible.
Yeah.
Right?
That's where Kant
and
sort
the
of starts
movement
from,
of
right?
physis, right?
Yeah.
Again, nature, right? Right? Physis, right? Alongside of nomos, which is convention and the law, but also physis, nature, and dynamis, that we forget a lot about, right? Yeah. So this generation has no idea. It's all machine, right? It's not really thinking about the dynamic. So anyway, this is a very good concept. It does not mean, it means you're really healthy. This is what they were really about in some ways. Philosophy, in some ways, at least at some levels, right, was really this drive, especially the Epicurean tradition, which Marx had great affection for, was a drive towards health and happiness. This was really the goal, right, in many ways. And happiness was also defined with you living in accordance with the soul, the rationality of the soul. So you're living in accordance with what you sort of are. And when Nietzsche says, another way of saying this, and I know we talked about this earlier, amor fatum, love your facticity, and then amor fati, love your fate, right? Not becoming a fatalist, but embrace, not only who you are, right? And anticipate that who you are. Again, future, right? The to come. No accident that Bauman uses the title, the coming community. The derrida, every other word at certain stages of his career, the coming, right? And why is it becoming, right? Always active becoming, in some ways. So yeah, this was was happening way back there. All right. So what were we going to say about Husserl? Yeah. No. No.
Oh no,
I mean,
there is an interesting school of phenomenology in Soviet philosophy, but the problem is it's not translated to English.
Oh, I see.
His Althusser's friend was a Georgian philosopher.
Yeah, you were
Mamoudzashvili.
telling me about him. Yeah.
Many thousands of pages.
Okay,
on,
okay.
Proust
Okay.
and things like that.
So remember again, in this diagram, there's an ascent. It's an ascension, right? And you can begin to see the two-tier, two-dimensional universe of Christianity here too. In some ways. Simplified, very much so. It's a two-tiered structure, two-dimensional space is playing out, right? The horizontal line has two centers of light, right? The sun and the good. So this is two centers of light. So it's also a theory of light that the Greeks have, and basically the eidos is the light. The history of philosophy is the history of eidos, right? of seeing, right? In some ways, Heidegger wants to confront that by hearing. In a lot of ways, yeah. So this is very interesting, right? So in order to see, you have to be, quote, good and just. So you have to pledge, this is Badiou in some ways. You begin to pledge a fidelity to the good and its governance, right? You pledge a fidelity to abstract thinking, to the ability to abstract, take apart, pull towards, right? Something, yeah, to abstract. Right? And the movement, as most of you know in Marxian dialectics, is from the abstract to the concrete. We see this is abstract, even though I can knock on it, etc. for Marx. Right? We must go through many levels to make sure we know what this is in the world of use value, the world of exchange, how it's fetishized, et cetera, right? So very, very interesting in that respect. So the line, the vertical obviously is leading to the real world, the line. And, you have a lack of technique of measurement, experiment, and analysis, and perceptions are very narrowly drawn, right here. So this is what happens below the line. You have no measurement and I'm trying to lead into, if you will, in a very, ancient philosophy way into Heidegger when he talks about clock time and measured time. The whole thing of clock time and measurement is really happening here in the divided line, the measurement, experiment, and analysis, right? So the third level, that's the second level, you have, this lack of measurement through belief. I believe that 2 + 3 = 5, But can I, prove it, synthesize it, right? I'm going to do it by my hands, 2 + 3, and I get one hand, 5, or something like this. This is, again, the synthetic judgment, and this plays out in Kant, in the analytic synthetic distinction in the first critique of reason, in a lot of ways, in many ways. Okay, so the third level here, as we get to the next level, is the world of mathematics, and this is where I think Badiou is kind of important in a sense. This is the world of or the transformation of these unreflective judgments. This is what's going on below the line, or unreflective judgments, right, into restoring intelligence and its order. So when you go to restoration of intelligence in the intelligible world is when you cross the line. And then the fourth and final level, for a term that we usually use, is the dialectic. This is the highest test of the validity of the hypothetical, is what dialectics does. Particularly in scientific reasoning. This goes on and on and on for many generations until the dialectic is kind of reworked by Hegel, into the is and the is not, as an elementary thing, the transformation of quantity into quality, and the logic of contradiction. Right? But in the beginning, it is testing the validity of the hypothetical. Okay? So, yeah, it is also an art of conversation, the art of dialogism, which is another thing we've forgotten how to do too. Because dialogism, and this is very interesting, it's Kantian in some ways, but it's also Heideggerian, Bakhtein's notion of the chronotope in history. You know the chronotope at all? The dialogical imagination? This is a great book. I mean, I suggest reading at least the first chapter by Mikhail Bakhtin.
Dostoevsky.
Well, he writes on Dostoevsky later, but this is called the dialogical imagination. It's a series of essays. Completely forgotten in the academy, unfortunately. One of these persons that went into favor, Bakhtin, Mikhail Bakhtin. And he speaks of the chronotope, the time zone of something. And the first novel is the Platonic dialogue. The first chronotope is the beginning of the dialogue in the agora and the conversation.
He wrote about Rabelais, a book about Rabelais.
Yes, he did. He wrote on the Carnivalesque, yes.
Yeah, the street and
Yes,
the
Carnivalesque.
the
in
community
particular.
in the street, and then
Right.
Dostoevsky's
Poetics.
Dostoevsky, he wrote about his dialogic.
He also may have been the author of the Formalist School, which again, people completely forgotten. Boris Eichenbaum, Victor Shklovsky, and Mikhail Bakhtin possible, but probably the code name at that time, or it may have been a figure, but a lot of people think it was Bakhtin. Voloshinov, Marxism and the Philosophy of Language. Worth reading. Great distinction between signaling and sign and materiality. Great book. again, it's almost so much time in the day, but anyway, this is well worth it. And answerability, art and answerability is another one he did. Yeah. And he was rediscovered in the 1970s by a whole new generation of scholars. And then it was taken up by Gary Saul Morrison and what's his name, Cheryl Emerson, and there's another person. They all took him up as a kind of, cause, right? And for a little, Michael Holquist was the other person. And, there was a book written about him, a couple of books written about him. But then it just floundered as a movement, and it's terrible, because literary studies is now in this kind of new historicism, which is completely ridiculous, and they know nothing. They know nothing. It's even watered down Greenblatt, much less, yeah, right? So anyway, this is another reason for a, quote, free university of the left, because these are the people that really need to be, these are the thinkers that are being ostracized, censored, left out, if you will, out of the curriculums.
I read Bakhtin in graduate school.
You read Bakhtin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was recommended to me by a teacher.
Good. Yeah.
So it was still around.
Yes, no, I'm aware of that, but it doesn't have a presence today.
No.
That's my point. And no one's really speaking to this and what you can actually do with it for, thinking both poetically, mathematically, and politically, and what this has to do with the, creation and, modern day poesis in particular, in my opinion. If you want to set up what Badiou does, around nature, matheme, or poem, that's another thing. So for Badiou, this divided line, the mathematical, is really more reflective of nature. That's a very Galilean position, right? In many ways, that the mathematization of nature occurs, in the period of the 17th century scientific project, right? Which Heidegger argues with. But Badiou seems to be engaged in that at some level, right? I mean, here's a very it's elementary, right, in some ways, but it's elementary on the level of what is objectivity, right? How do we get to levels of objectivity, yeah? How do we get out of our subjective illusions, our subjective beliefs? How do we put this aside, our opinions, etc.? This is what this whole allegory of the cave is. And how do you test the validity of hypotheses back then, in a sense, right? So, yeah. But Bakhtin, again, going back, Shklovsky, another great formalist, books on a great book, Theory of Literature, Victor Shklovsky. Boris Eichenbaum on the great Gogol story, The Overcoat. You know this? Yeah?
I know the overcoat.
Yeah. He does a great analysis of the overcoat itself, formally, in the text. And and Voloshinov, Marxism and the Philosophy of and the book is called one of the great books. It's called The Formalist Method in Scholarship. Because this was the Russian formalists, and they and the Prague structuralists, in my opinion, filter into Paris and help produce structuralism and post-structuralism. Mm-hmm. And there's very little credit given to, the Czechs especially, and very, very little to the formalists too, except to Jakobson, because he was a friend of Lacan's.
Well, formalism was really anathema to the Soviet Union.
Well, I know during the show trials they used to say, "Are you a student of Shklovsky?" was one of the interrogators' questions. Are you a student of Wolski? Every time an academic from the literature department would come in, because he was the bad, he was the, who, Victor or Dmitri? Maybe Dmitri. Yes, I knew Dmitri, not Victor. I knew the brother. Is he the brother of Victor? Maybe I knew him. I met him maybe once.
They were always
Yes. Shklovsky was a dirty word during
formalism was
formalism itself, but Shklovsky was the high formalist of the period. And he ended up living in an apartment about 1.5 the times the size of this room, books everywhere, and, people would go visit him, to Shklovsky. This is how they have me living, he would say. As long as I have my books, I'm okay. This is Victor Wolski at work. Yeah, yeah. He died. I mean, he lived a long life, and continued to write and think. He wrote beautiful stuff on film. I like Wolski a lot. You know, you can look at a kind of, you know, I'm sorry to, again, divert a little bit here, but I think it's interesting. You know, Eisenstein's, film sense and, Shklovsky's writing on the cinema are very close. It's very interesting. So they knew each other during this, to my mind, 17 to 24, despite Weimar in Germany, was one of the greatest creative outpourings that the world ever had. Certainly in the 20th century, by far, in my book.
It was
between
a formalist
films,
period
the
for
pain.
Russia. Yeah.
Yes, pretty amazing. Yeah, well, it was called the Soviet Union then.
Soviet Union.
I call it every time everybody refers to it. You mean formerly the Soviet Union? Huh? When they say Russia, I'm Russian. Oh, you're part of formerly the Soviet Union. That's what I tell the students. They all kind of half smile when I say that. Right.
The country formerly known as Russia.
Yes, country
Yeah.
formerly known. That's the
better.
good novel
That's
title.
better.
That's the novel title. The Red Angel. Yeah, we're going to get Jennifer Lawrence in about 3 weeks. The Red Sparrow. She's conditioned to come to seduce people in the West.
Is that a film or a
Yeah,
TV?
film. Yeah, well, they're hyping it like crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, they should be getting those T-shirts for the Olympics.
The Red Sparrow.
No, the country formerly known as Russia.
Oh, I see. Oh, yeah. All praise for North Korea, huh? Yeah, we see the salute. Maybe everybody will raise the North
Did
Korean.
you hear they found somebody in South Korea found a double that looks like the chairman
Oh, good.
to make a joke
Yeah.
and there was a message from the North says, cease immediately with these foolish, and they stopped.
Right. He knows how to get his sister in there to pull off a few moments.
They're like,
right?
enough of these pranks.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, look, the guy's an expert on cowboy movies. I mean, you would think by now he's figured out the West. I mean, he has one of the world's largest collections, I understand. He loves
So
American
weird.
Westerns.
Who's
So I
this
think he's
Pence?
seen. No, Pence is a moron. He's reading Genesis every night, Gideon's Bible, right?
Excuse me.
Yeah,
The
no,
General
the
Secretary of the North Korean
the
party.
General Secretary of North Korea, otherwise known as the One, right? The One.
Rocket Man.
Rocket Man. Right? What did he tell Trump with his hair? He showed his doesn't blow in the wind. Much better
When
hair.
the missile launched.
Yeah. My hair doesn't blow. Yeah. Who can dream this up? But anyway, this is where we are. It's great. It's great, huh?
Yeah,
Have you seen the movie Snowpiercer? Any of you?
Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
good movie.
Yeah, very good film.
It's a good one.
Yeah, yeah, Korean film. Yeah, South Korean film. At the end of the world, the train is built to circle the globe.
Oh, yeah, the
right?
gangster
It's
film.
Snowpiercer, right? And the engine, you go from class struggle, car to car.
The train, the space of the front of the train is the
The
upper class.
engine,
The back of the train is
the rebellion.
the
And it's violent. It's very violent.
Very
Yeah.
violent. Oh, yes.
It's a good movie, yeah.
Yeah, she's great. Tilda Swinton in that. She's a fantastic actress in that. Yeah, they're all good. William Hurt is in it, right? And also what's his name? The other Ed Harris plays the man of the engine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting film though. They do good things, and the same guy, the same director did this film. What was it called? About they created this monster because of the experiments in South Korea after World War II. The Host, right? And this monster terrorizes, and then he falls in love, the monster, with this 14-year-old. She's a famous Korean actress. It's very funny. Yeah, very, very funny. Yeah. The sea monster, the state itself, coming up, created by the United States. Yeah, very, very interesting. Same director. It's good. Yeah. Anyway, all right. So I don't know. I hope this helps a little bit in terms of really the question here for Heidegger again is aletheia, the play of light and what's hidden and unhidden. And if you can read it at this level, you begin to see at least part of the concealment and unconcealment that's going on as well between the sensible and the intelligible worlds, right? And then also the question of, for Heidegger, the question is not that being as good, it's just being, right? We have forgotten the pre-Socratic. So he wants to go further back before this is systematized, right? The dialogue is with the pre-Socratics who have not been corrupted. And where are we going? We're going towards direct intuition, right? Ultimately. How do we ultimately, this is the goal, for phenomenology, is how do we get to direct intuition like the pre-Socratics had, through all this thing. So the task is always unlearning so that we can get back to these kind of powers, right? Yeah. So you're in a process of both concept formation but also concept undoing, right? Constantly, right? And the Germans are very good at this. They write books called, writing of concepts, Begriffen Schriften, right? A whole history, right? 10 volumes, how concepts are written. It's an unbelievable culture. I mean, to put it mildly. Yeah. I'm looking forward to working with the Rosa Luxemburg people. Anyway, if we do, we'll see.
You may be disappointed.
No, I'm not. I have no expectations. I have anticipations, but no expectations. I'm like Mick Jagger in that regard. Yeah, no expectations. Yeah. So anyway, okay, well, good. Yeah,
I think it's the arm of the Social Democratic Party, right? It's funded by them. No,
they're
it was
Lincoln.
the Lincoln.
They're
Oh, it's the
Lincoln. Yeah,
Lincoln.
they're
Oh, that's
Lincoln.
better.
No, they're
Yeah.
better. They're the left
Oh, it's
wing.
the Friedrich Ebert Foundation.
Yeah,
It's the SPD,
we're
yeah.
not interested in them. No, this is Der Linke. These are commies.
They're Die Linke.
The question is what kind and how close are, because situation has very many elements of Luxemburgism. Yeah. Okay, so let's go back to the text, and take a look at this. This is what I'm thinking, though. I mean, if you can read for next time, and I'll see if I can get this again. I mean, I'm spinning. We've done it the 13th, the 27th, last week, and now 4 times already. This in 2018. I mean, luckily I got a good relationship with the secretary who books these things, but I don't want him to deny us. So I'll put out an email. I'll know by Tuesday if we can use this again next week. But for next week, make sure you look and I want Chris to come, so I'm going to call this up the MTA. Sections very carefully, 72, and I'm going to go a little bit over this, but very carefully, temporality and historicity. And then the following week, and I thought another thing we could do is look at temporality, section 68, chapter 4, of the temporality of understanding, attunement, falling prey, and discourse. So we'll get into the time element of this. This is section 68, chapter 4. So we're going to go temporality, everydayness, right? But first temporality, historicity. So we're kind of retrospectively, moving through this, right? So we're going to go historicity, right?
So all of chapter 5?
Too much?
No. It's just that in
30,
certain sections of
29
chapter
people.
5, they reference earlier chapters.
Yes, that's true, but I'm not stopping you to read that.
Okay.
There's no ecclesiastical censor in court. You know what I mean? I mean, the Pope is not given a dictum, right? Or whatever. You can go back to those chapters. I mean, the thing. Look. In some ways, yes. No, it's true. I mean, what I want to do is chapter 1, 50, 51, 52, and 53 of Division 2, right? I want to go through the ontological structure of death, being towards death, and everydayness of Dasein. If you want to begin there and then go forward to historicity, I have no problem.
Okay.
If that makes sense to you, we would go back into everydayness from this section, right? Yeah? Yeah? Okay? So why don't we do that then? Chapter 1 begins page 240. I mean, it doesn't begin on, but read. I would begin 237, section 49, 50, 51, 52, and 53. Okay, and we'll talk about authenticity and inauthenticity, which is the next chapter. You don't have to read it. I can do that without you reading it. And then we'll go on to temporality and historicity, and then kind of do a summation. So I'm figuring, 3 more weeks, right? Next week is next week, Dasein and its everydayness and being towards death. Then the week after that is historicity, right? And temporality of understanding, attunement, falling prey, and discourse. Or we could maybe, since it's not that much, 237 to 256. And then also I would read 320 to 333. 334, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yep. And then the following week we'll do historicity and then sum it up. Okay? So what I would like to do today, to kind of begin with the text again, you have this, look, this is a kind of standard, here, in terms of kind of understanding the Platonic universe and where some of the debates today are, Again, I can locate, here, this is where the Badiouian moment begins, right? Is in this turn, right, which is in Book 6 and Book 7 of the Republic, the turn. And this is where we begin to see physis, nature. It's the Greek word, nature. And the matheme or poem, right? Question mark. Heidegger goes this way. It is only through the poetic and through the house of language that we ultimately would hear the call to be. We would be able to still ask the question. For Badiou, the ontology, the being, right? It has to be through this because the subtraction will leave something called language. Right? So both are on the same page, right? That we're still speaking subjects and writing subjects, but different moments, right? In terms of the objects which they're going to deal with, right?
You said that
Yeah.
Heidegger wanted to replace seeing, which is the usual
Not to replace,
philosophical-
but to
with
privilege
hearing.
more hearing, yes.
Hearing.
Right. So in other words, you're deconstructing diagrams like this, the eidos, through the unhiddenness, right? Both in terms of language to the ear, right? And also through the eidos as sight. Because the history of Western philosophy and the history of metaphysics, the idea comes from seeing, the notion of idea.
And Derrida wants to bring it back to sight again.
I think what Derrida does differently than Heidegger is he's looking at Grammaire, and I'm going to let you talk a little bit about that today. Yeah, he wants to go back to Grammaire, right, to the writing, right,
Yes.
etc., and study the writing in the relationship to what kind of metaphorics of sight, what kind of metaphorics of hearing, what kind of metaphorics of all the sentences are happening here that transport us, into these words, and how do you begin to deconstruct, right, those kind of regimes of writing. So he can take a book like this, which he spends his whole life doing, I think, in some ways, This is one fundamental text. The phenomenology, parts of Hegel's logic, obviously capital, but they all read that early on. That's like high school reading for a lot of these guys. They keep going back to it. I'm building it up much better than it is, really. But anyway, they do have a very super high-powered educational system. I go study the children's books when I'm in Montreal, and you can see how far ahead they are pedagogically. If I had children and I lived in Montreal, I would not get near the English schools. I would send all the kids to French schools. They're going to learn English there, but they're going to also learn a very different kind of pedagogy, a sharpness of the Cartesian method and all this. So going back, this is a fundamental text to him, as is parts of Nietzsche, but this is very fundamental, as is Freud. And since his wife, who's actually cited in the lectures you gave me, she helped these people very much. She's still alive. Marguerite is a practicing psychoanalyst, right? Many years, right? Etc. Yeah. So he has that too. So look at Derrida's investigate. Freud and the scene of writing. He's looking at the scene of the writing. Where does the psychic machine itself emerge in, through the magic writing pad in Freud, yeah? And what's under erasure, right? He's very, very good at this, right? The other people, always an encounter with Heidegger. There are very few texts that never have some reference to the Heideggerian project, right? Husserl, early on, he writes on Genesis and structure and, the beginning in Husserl. How do we search for the beginning? What is the genesis of something? And as you know, phenomenologically, Husserl wanted to get to the moment of emergence of the discoveries, right? So Galileo's moment, you would be able to constitute in its imminence, right, so to speak. And this was part of the strategy of the crisis in European sciences. How did this all come together, right, at the moment of discovery, and how can we do this, into the future, right, to be able to constitute these things. So this crucial word, so from Heidegger, he's going to get the in the world, but from Husserl, he'll get the of. We're always consciousness of something. So he'll read Husserl through the metaphorics of consciousness and intentionality. He'll read Heidegger through the lens of being, and then what's, ultimately under erasure. So if this is under erasure, it means that the intentionality and the intentional objects and the subject to object and constitution of the object's correlation is not operative anymore, right? He'll put that under erasure. The same thing with being, right? He'll go back and ask, what did this mean when Heidegger did this? Because remember, Heidegger says it's an empty concept.
It's no thing.
Yes.
Time is no thing.
Well, that's true. Yeah. You've had encounters with no thing.
What?
Have you had encounters with no thing?
With
nothing?
Often
All the time, yeah.
I'm anticipating and it is no thing.
Right. To deny our nothingness, huh?
It is and it isn't.
Right.
Or
It's
the memo,
dialectical.
Yes, it is dialectical. Yes.
the memo was a nothing burger. That was the latest, the vaunted Republican memo from
The
the
news.
committee.
To what?
Oh, the Nunes memo.
The Nunes memo.
Yeah, it was good. One of the Democrats said it's a nothing burger.
It's a nothing burger.
That's the
I love
level.
their language.
That's the level of it. They're all eating
Your
burgers
frogs.
at,
Yeah, well.
in D.C. at Duke Zebert's down the block on K Street, yeah. Yeah. It's unbelievable, yeah.
I thought that was one of their more poetic.
Well, that's good, yeah, the nothing burger, right? Okay. They'll probably use it in the campaign. Trump delivered the nothing burger.
Right.
Nothing inside.
They gave
Here's your
birth to the nothing
taxes,
burger.
right? You're going to pay all for the buns, right? This is what the people do, and then the rich get all the, the meat and the condiments and the, et cetera inside. Yeah. Anyway, all right. Listen, this is what I'd like to do: is go back to the end here, and if you turn to page 413, I think it is. Yeah, the existential and temporal analytic. This is the conclusion, right? I want to start here today, with the Heidegger. Page 413, the existential and temporal analytic of Dasein and the fundamental ontological question of the meaning of being in general. You can see he's going to come full circle here from the beginning, right? Okay, the task of the foregoing considerations was to interpret, one, the primordial totality of factical Dasein with regards to its possibilities of authentic and inauthentic existing. Eudaimonia in the Greek sense, for Heidegger, Eigenlichkeit, right? And Eigenlichkeit. What is proper to one's own, what is improper to one's own. Yep. Okay? And to do so existentially and ontological in terms of its ground. Temporality revealed itself as this ground. Okay? So it's always been as seen or Dasein within the horizon of temporality. Right? And with this it revealed itself as the meaning of being of care. So this is something, to my mind, that Deleuze and Guattari don't have, even though it's a beautifully written book and it's a very, caring book in some way. They don't really have a theory of care for capitalism and schizophrenia. They don't really have that working in their text. First thing I sense in terms of that. Okay, so thus what the preparatory, again, preparation, crucial, the preparatory existential analytic of Dasein contributed prior to setting forth temporality has now been taken back into temporality as the primordial structure of the totality of being of Dasein. We've gone from a descriptive phenomenology back to a kind of conceptual moment in terms of the totality of the being of Dasein, right? Okay. In terms of the possible ways in which primordial time can temporalize itself, we have provided the grounds for those structures that we have only indicated earlier. Setting forth the constitution of being of Dasein, however, still remains only one path or one way we can take. Our goal is to work out the question of being in general. Our thematic and an analytic of existence needs, in its turn, the light from a previous clarified idea of being in general. That is especially true if the statement expressed in our introduction is retained as a standard for every philosophical investigation. And here it is, the standard. Philosophy is universal phenomenological ontology, beginning with a hermeneutic of Dasein, which, as an analytic of existence, has made fast the guideline for all philosophical questioning at the point where it arises and into which it is folded back. Okay? Of course, this thesis must not be taken dogmatically, but as a formulation of the fundamental problem that is still veiled. And that fundamental problem is we have forgotten, and we have forgotten the meaning of being, right? Providing the question, asking the question, and forgotten the meaning. Can ontology be grounded ontologically, or does it need for this an ontic foundation, and which being must take over the function of this foundation? Going back to what I've at least perused from the reading from Derrida in his lectures, this is a place where he kind of begins, right, in History of Being, his lectures in 64, 65. Basically going to say Heidegger really was it's being in history that's the question, no longer just the destruction or the, rewriting of ontology. Okay, the distinction between the being of existing Dasein and the being of beings unlike Daseins, for example, objective presence, may seem to be illuminated, but it's only the point of departure for the ontological problematic. It is nothing with which philosophy can rest and be satisfied. We have long known that ancient ontology deals with reified concepts, and that the danger exists of reifying consciousness. But what does reifying mean? Where does it arise from? Why is being initially conceived in terms of what is objectively present, and not in terms of things of hand that do, after all, lie near to us? Why does this reification come to dominate again and again? How is the being of consciousness positively structured so that reification remains inappropriate to it? Is the distinction between consciousness and things sufficient at all? And this is an attack on phenomenology, right? Sufficient at all for a primordial unfolding of the ontological problematic? Do the answers to these questions lie along our way? And can the answer even be searched for as long as the question of the meaning being in general remains unasked and unclarified? All right? So here you can see Lukács, right, somewhat, in terms of reification and class consciousness, even though he probably did not read that section, right, may have been aware. But for him, the early Marxist interpretation of reified consciousness still remained within objectivity, as science would have it, still within the present to hand, that we talked about earlier, right? It's still in that. It's still an epistemological construct, and it also is indebted to the philosophy of consciousness, i.e., phenomenology in consciousness, right? Right? Heidegger is not a consciousness. He's not really doing the philosophy of consciousness. I know I mentioned this multiple times. This is not the Husserlian intentionality, the of something, that I am conscious of Josh, Phil, Nori, Sean, David, Chris, and Arto in the room, and hearing my voice, so to speak. Right? That's not what Heidegger's about. About that kind of consciousness of either others or consciousness of things in the world and understanding how we constitute things that way. Yeah, he's not really about that through consciousness. It's more through, remember, the access is being in the world, the there-ness of being, right? Much more place, topology, if you will. That in Badiou they have in common, although Heidegger is going to take topology not in the mathematical sense, but as the sense of place versus space. And I'm going to go back to the footnote in a second, the note on the note, right? Because
Space is time and time is space.
in Bergson,
No, in Heidegger
yes,
or Hegel.
in Hegel.
Hegel.
Right. We're going to go through this. We'll go through the note. Right? Okay, so he goes on here, So again, the main thing to take away, if you will, from this section 1 all the way to section 83 is that we are thrown into the world, right? We're in the world being, right? We're always in the world being, if you want to think of this prepositionally, in the world being. We are, right? We are. We are being towards death, the other proposition, within this resoluteness, anticipatory resoluteness that we can encounter in our being towards death. And remember, he speaks of natality and mortality, and then the betweenness, right? He uses this term, right? We're actually beginning to develop projects, right? Etc. Right? And a person without a project, to Heidegger, is basically dead, right? Yeah. No, seriously, this is the dictatorship of the they, without a project, right? Without a project. For him. Yeah. This is not the welfare state at work, right? Might be the welfare of trans-individuation in the Simondonian sense. It may be the welfare of the authentic existence, right? Which coincides with welfare, but it is not, quote unquote, that we are, about to go out of our way in the old Judeo-Christian or more in the Christian sense of charity and, the
This
Good
is maybe where
Samaritan and all
it's such a
this.
radical philosophy, because it's not.
Okay.
He does not make an argument that some can achieve the project and others cannot. There's absolutely none of that in here. So the implication is this is a general. Dasein is sort of this general human propensity or predisposition towards having projects.
Right.
So it can't possibly be a Nazi work. You know what I mean? Like there's none of
Well,
this.
I think I told you, Das Mann, to my mind, the way I read this, and I can have a few people, that I know read it this way too. Das Mann is the Nazi, right? In a way, it's the everyday, the Das
everyday,
Mann,
yeah.
without the project, without the possibility. Right. This is really,
Right.
this is the code that's operating.
It's almost like there's.
I mean, the authenticity. Go ahead. Yeah, I'm sorry.
there's
Yeah,
clear.
yeah.
Maybe that's why Badiou sort of compelled to respond to this with his own ontology. But there is a hypothesis here of, the post-liberal society. The hypothesis is sort of to avoid, in this movement towards death, to have a project, to maintain this kind of engagedness in the world. Maybe
Right.
this is his politics. This is what is lacking in his world. Which is, so there is a great sort of radicalism in here. It's if we
Yeah, I mean,
if we
it
follow
is
this
a
sort
kind of politics of the making of something.
totally
right?
open-ended
The
in terms of the
politics of the
possibility.
poiein. It is the possibility of closing time and the openness of possibility. Right. The closing time is the end of. If you want to think of it this way, opening and closing may be two good phrases to use. it's closing time in the sense of the end of Western metaphysics, right? There's closure that has been evolved. All we're doing is looking at representations and undoing those. In Derrida's sense, who knows the closure is operative, is looking at regimes of writing and trying to deconstruct from there, right? And look at white mythology and the text of philosophy. He'll do things like this. So all of this, in some ways is about the closure, right? And where representational thinking is, right? And then, of course, the opening is to the anticipatory notion of the unknown future, but it is open, right? And the lever, if you will, the interpretive lever, is the aletheia and the aletheological, that things have been concealed, we have to unconceal. It's no longer, quote, linear, chronological, these kind of things, but temporalities, interpretive tool is something like aletheia, that you're moving away in the alpha privative from the shadows, the illusions, and all of these kind of things, right? Moving forward, yeah? If that makes sense, that helps, yeah. So, opening, closing is a good time. Closing time, is really a good way of looking at this. You say at the bar it's closing time. Well, this is closing time of Western metaphysics, right?
It's T.S. Eliot's.
Yeah, sure.
Area, please, it's closing time.
Yes, yes, indeed. Yeah. Set him up, Joe. It's 3:45. No place in the joint but you and me. Anyway. Right. Okay, so let me just go forward with this, because this is kind of the closing, paragraphs, if you will, of the whole work, and then we can go back and see. But, he's going to say, I haven't really accomplished much here. So there is a humbleness to this guy in some ways, right?
Relative
I'm just
to tradition.
beginning.
Yeah.
Relative to
400
the
pages
tradition.
to do it,
Yes,
but-
right. Yeah. We're 415.
Yeah.
415.
Humbleness or
Yeah.
obsessiveness.
415 times about, let's see, this is probably about 350, 400 words per page. So we're at about, almost over 250,000 words. We still haven't gotten anywhere. Right. We can never inquire, next paragraph, into the origin and the possibility of the idea. And he puts idea in question, idea being in general, with the means, and this is interesting
It's
here
interest-
for
so
you.
interesting, yeah.
The formal and the logical abstraction. It's not going to come to us through Hegelian logic, and we're talking more about this, right? Yeah, and this is something we'll do in the next year or 2 years, whatever. We'll go back to this kind of stuff because it's very, very deep, in a lot of ways. That is, not without a secure horizon. So the first task is to get the secure horizon for questions and answers. We must look for a way to illuminate the fundamental ontological question and follow it, right? Not the only way, but a way, right? Whether that way is at all the only one or even the right one can be decided only after we have followed it. So as Yogi Berra says, when I come to the crossroads, I take it. Yeah, he's being very Heideggerian here. Right. Whether that way is at all the only one or even the right one can be decided only after we have followed it. The conflict with respect to the interpretation of being cannot be settled because it has not yet been kindled, not yet gotten the fire yet up. In the end, one cannot just rush into the conflict. Rather, igniting this conflict already requires a preparation.
The war.
Indeed. Yeah, you can see the war machine working here right now. You can see it. It cannot be jumped into, but the beginning of the strife already needs preparation. This investigation is solely underway to that. Where does it stand? And you can get the military sense here too. I mean, the language. Where does it stand? Something like being has been disclosed in the understanding of being that belongs to existing Dasein as a way in which it understands. The preliminary disclosure of being, although it is unconceptual, makes it possible for Dasein as existing being in the world to be related to beings to those it encounters in the world, as well as to itself and existing. How is the disclosive understanding of being belonging to design possible at all? Can the question be answered by returning to the primordial constitution of being a design that understands being? The existential and the ontological constitution of the totality of design is grounded in temporality. Accordingly, a primordial mode of temporalizing of ecstatic temporality itself must make the ecstatic project of being in general possible. How is this mode of the temporalizing of temporality to be interpreted? Is there a way leading from primordial time, and again he's trying to get to primordial time in the previous section, to the meaning of being? Does time itself reveal itself as the horizon of being? Now, 62, he will speak to this when he writes the little piece beginning with Paul Clay's, Saints at the Window, I think it is, and the couple of pieces that we don't understand it. We don't understand indecidability in Heisenberg. And then he goes on to talk about time and event, right? Yeah, in the Time and Being of 1962 lecture. So he's going to say, yes, the answer really is being is as time, right? This is really what this book was being as time, if you read him retrospectively from later on in his career. But it is only we can get there through this Dasein. We need the Dasein analytic and the existential analytic, which is crucial to getting there to that horizon and beginning to understand ourselves as series of ecstatic temporality, as futural. The anxiety will meet us in the anticipatory resoluteness, not from the past. It's not the anxiety of the past. When you have this nothingness, again, it's futural nothingness, it's not past. When the psychologists or the analysts and all these people talk about its patterns, its gestalt, in some ways they're right, but to Heidegger, that's very little part of the issue. Very little. It's the underlying anxiety before the future that really needs to be addressed in many ways. And I did tell you he had his own, little encounter with madness.
You did?
I mean, yes, after
He
the
recovered.
war. He recovered, yeah, obviously. Time and being. Yeah. Right.
You sure now?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah.
All these philosophers with their encounters with madness,
Well, Mallarmé
Philosopher's
too,
Stone.
and poets.
poets of
Poets,
course,
when
with
Plato, yeah, well, poets
Well,
and
they're
philosophers, there's a
supposed to
thin
be
line.
mad.
This is one of the reasons analytical philosophy is so boring. They stay away from the poets. These guys want to, engage, and including Badiou. I mean, he writes a piece called, it's Temporal, the Age of the Poets. That's his title. It's important to pay attention carefully to, not only the, to the titles and of course the language. This is what he's trying to sensitize us to. The French scene, in my opinion, philosophical scene of the 1950s and 60s is impossible without Jean Hippolyte. Jean Hippolyte sensitized a whole generation to reading Hegel line by line, phrase by phrase, attuned them how to read carefully, Not this kind of, bullshit we get in this country, you reconstruct the text and all this kind of nonsense, close reading. No, sensitize oneself to the text that you begin to see the metaphorics, the similes. You see all these things that work, you begin to see,
That's how I read Hegel.
I know that.
Hippolyte, Genesis, and
Structure,
structure
right.
in Hegel.
Right.
He didn't sleep much, apparently.
He
4
didn't
hours
need
at
to
night
sleep.
was enough.
Chain smoke too. Yeah. Great teacher. According to, I never met him, but, from what I understand. Yeah. One of Derrida's teachers, certainly Althusser's teacher. Yeah. And then you had Kojève, who was the showman. Kojève was Being Towards Death live
Yeah.
every week on the seminar in Hegel, and Lacan's there learning strategies, right, in terms of his performances. Yeah, Kojève was the performative, Hippolyte was the scholar and sensitivity to textual exegesis. And, in a lot of ways, it's interesting because, in some ways we forget how to summarize, we forget how to do textual exegesis, we forget how to enter into the critical moment. Everybody takes a little phrase, but it's out of context, and then they try to build a paper. And this person said this, and then you get 9 pages,
You stitch it together.
15 pages of nonsense about something that had no meaning to begin with out of the context in which it's extracted from. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm serious.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. As Sonny Boy Williamson said, in 1958, I corrected all my mistakes. That's the way to do it with reading. Correct your mistakes in reading. Yeah. he said I don't fatten no more frogs for snakes. But anyway, which they're not putting on headlines in the New York Times now. That kind of language is not good. The language of the blues, right? Right? What happens to the blues with the Me Too movement?
What happens to
Yeah,
what?
what happens to the blues as a form?
You can't have it. What are
Can't
gonna
have the
sing
blues
about?
anymore, right?
Well, that's an interesting point. I mean, in the
I mean, think
sanitations
about the
and discourse,
forms
What are you gonna
in
talk
terms
about?
of the
Yeah.
sanitized discourse or this kind of thing. Again, not no condoning of the behavior. I mean, I knew people like Weinstein. Growing up, I'm sure we all did. In some ways, these are disgusting characters, no question about it. And to be having to use that in order to get over and do it on a consistent basis is disgusting. Yeah, we know this, right? Especially, in the 70s after a very, very strong, in my opinion, feminist upsurge. The feminism of the 60s, second wave feminism, was very strong, in a way. And I think it changed a lot of people, et cetera. And then you have these animals that come out here and then use these positions, of power to do this. But on the other hand, what does it suppress in speech, right? And in art forms, in a certain way. Just like the trauma in the classroom, right? Think about this. I'm traumatized by this language in the novel.
The trigger, yeah.
Right, the trigger phrases.
You have to
I
tell me
mean, what is
first what I'm
going
gonna
on?
inherit.
You can't read more than 2 pages of The Naked Lunch out of 100 of Burroughs, which is one of the most important novels on state surveillance, and is really the pretext for the entire conception of the societies of control. This is what Deleuze is reading. He's reading it creatively. He conceptualized. Burroughs doesn't call it society. Burroughs too smart to do this. It takes a stupid philosopher to come along with a society of control, right? Burroughs is really doing it with Dr. Benway. He's showing you, in the Naked Lunch. Yeah. So what are we supposed to do in this kind of context? Because this is really thought police. In a way, it's gone beyond disciplinary practices in Foucault's sense, or the societies of control. It's much more than just control. This is really the policing of thought, and the policing of
almost like the
form,
management
and the
of thought.
policing of
Yeah.
creativity in a certain way. And this goes on from what I talked. I talked to 2 or 3 people who practice psychoanalysis, and one's very good at child psychoanalysis. Says the children today, they're just trained to behave. They're like, seals in the zoo. Like this. They're not, the creativity is not there. Spontaneity it's rejected. And everything is group activity. Oh, let's get in the groups. Now today, Robbie, you should be with so and so, and this is
You're the
this
leader
is their
today.
levels. This is the levels, and what kind of society is that building? So anyway, I have thought. I'm not maybe articulating them well enough, but I'm not trying to say that So we always come up. First of all, it was identity politics, right? There's always something that comes up that the left gets taken in by, right? In a sense, and again. I'd be the first person out there if we were going to do a march on Weinstein's apartment and ransack it, and take material goods so we can fund the revolution. To me, that's an idea. You know what I mean? I'm sure he's got some nice artwork on the wall
True.
that Josh can fence, through Safrashi and Company, and
good.
yeah. So,
Unfortunately,
yeah.
the white supremacy is another form of identity politics.
absolutely, yes. No, it's working on both sides. Yeah, that's the whole point. And this is where, again, the Derridian moment of différance, right, which is a very subversive concept. I mean, to me, this is subversive thinking. I mean, I think that in order to, as Foucault said, we need a revolution in thinking. His reading of Kant's, the Age of Enlightenment, right? What is enlightenment? You always need a revolution in thinking because the political, economic revolution is not enough.
That's right.
Yeah, it's never enough. Tomorrow we could do redistribution of wealth, put all these characters in jail, but do we really have a revolutionary consciousness in terms of the thinking of the new, the new? It's a real question. Yeah, yeah. We're always good at the critique, that the left has always had. Well, what does it mean to the practice? So the question of thought, right, and thinking of difference. What is difference, right? In a way, this is Derrida. Différence is a way of trying to avoid, the structure of ideology that would remain after the revolution, right? Look how fast. You look at Soviet bureaucracy. Look at how fast, these party apparatchiks got a hold of the pie, right? That was opened up by Yeltsin, into the first moments of Putin. Look how fast that those bureaucrats took it. I got a student from Bulgaria. Right? I have a Bulgarian
Tennis player.
sure, tennis player. You remember, right?
You said.
She's very good. Yeah, number 2 ranked. She hasn't been defeated this year. Anyway, but anyway, I can tell that the family itself, knew how to maneuver outside of Sofia, right, to get to London, to live in London, how this all works, right, in a sense. Where did it come from? It was not a new kind of, it was a kind of, we're living in the Hobbesian universe, we're going back to Hobbes, Yeah, yeah. Every man for himself and God against all.
In a certain sense, though, in those societies, the transformation was the intelligentsia, so-called.
Yes.
They were the worst ones.
The worst.
The working,
The intelligent.
the working.
No,
person
I'm aware of that.
Still maintains fidelity to.
I'm aware of that. I know a lot of people,
the project of the
contractors
left,
in
yeah.
Montreal, who came out of that. They're
It's
very,
the
very
intellectuals,
decent
they're
people.
the problem.
It was the intelligentsia.
That's the
Yes.
problem.
No, I agree. Yeah, yeah.
Maybe that's why
Well,
Derrida
Mao
focused
understood
on
this.
the cultural
Boy, did
revolution.
he understand it.
Gotta make them wear hats.
Just throw it all up in the air.
You kind of think about the Cultural Revolution in a totally different way now.
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
I would recommend again the documentary at the Film Forum, In the Intense Now, because
Yeah, I'm gonna go, yeah.
really.
I know the Chris Marquer film. It was a,
Yeah, I saw it. I
the
saw it
great
last
Chris
night.
Marquer film
Yeah,
on May of
because-
'68.
Because it really goes,
You saw it, Phil, too?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's interesting. I mean, he's trying to do a Chris Marquer
Yeah, yeah.
thing,
Yeah, yeah.
with
Yeah.
archival
Right,
stuff.
yeah.
But it's more personal,
Yeah, okay.
than Marquer. Because he's Brazilian, and his family's living in Paris.
During May of '68 or
Yeah.
now? Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
And they go to China during the Cultural Revolution.
Well, his mother does, it wasn't clear that,
Yeah, it's not clear that but
He
they
was
took
evidently,
all
yeah,
this
he was- yeah.
film of, what they saw there. They had no idea what was going on, but they were just, going to the Great Wall.
Red Guard.
That's hilarious.
no,
yeah,
Little red books.
And people were running around with red books, and they
Yeah.
were
They
like
thought-
filming that,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah,
Badiou's the communist
Right.
hypothesis. That is red. It's a
Yeah.
little red book.
Yeah.
Yeah, by the way.
Yeah.
Oh,
I think that's a star.
I
on it.
knew these guys. That was one of my first introductions to, to sort of radical politics with these guys who were
Mao?
fancied themselves as Maoists, and
But not the Avakian crowd, right?
well, they were the original Avakian crowd.
Oh, the original, okay.
The Revolutionary Union, not
Yeah, I remember Revolution.
Yeah, the
Sure,
RU.
Sure.
And so, you'd go to one of their study groups, and they'd be all sitting around with their little red book, And the thing was, and
It sold more copies than the Bible.
I know. And they go,
Right,
and so
right.
what about this, you know? And everybody like,
On page 18.
Yeah.
He speaks,
Yeah,
the
there
chairman
it is.
speaks about contradictions.
Yes.
Right. I remember they said that.
You know, and I was like, these people are fucking nuts.
This is on the West Coast?
Yeah, this is
The West Coast had a very, very strong, you know, they had
Oh,
some
yeah.
in New York, but certainly the West Coast was strong, especially in the Bay Area.
Yeah, this was in Orange County.
In Orange, oh my God.
Yeah.
Okay.
And,
Well, they had Nixon as a target, right?
well,
Yeah.
sure.
All,
You know,
the,
it was-
all those guys came
It
from.
was rougher in Orange County.
But you feel it at like the
Yeah.
West Coast. Like I was in Oakland for the first time a year ago, and I went to Berkeley, and you see these bookstores, these giant bookstores filled with Marx and Hegel. I mean,
Oh, yeah, of
and
course.
many people looking at the books and
Oh,
buying.
yeah.
And I mean,
I took the bus. I used to
very
take
much
the
in the
bus from
culture.
Marin County over to over the Golden Gate, and you'd be on the bus, and there are people reading the Phenomenology in German
Yeah.
at the back of the bus. I mean, I'm saying, yeah, I've died and gone to heaven here, you know, in a sense. But it was a little bit too passive for my taste. So I like the East Coast, you know, the machinery better. But anyway, yeah. And you know, well, City Lights is still open.
yeah.
City Lights is a great bookstore. I mean, a great
Yeah.
bookstore. Yeah.
And anyway, just, you know,
Yeah. The film,
the
right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the footage, particularly of May '68 and around, you know, he shows incredible footage of like the video transmissions of de Gaulle in the New Year's message of '67 and the New
Right.
Year's message of '68.
And then he finishes with the New Year's message of '68, you know, which is
Right.
identical practically.
Right, bookends, but, you know,
Yeah.
you know, so much happened in between those bookends. But
Right.
what I thought was really good is he really uses the film, you know, it's archival, you know, it's some of his home video, to explicate, you know, in a very fine-grained way, details that sort of show the contradictions,
Mhm.
you know, in the coming commodification.
Right.
And he has stills of
Yeah. 'Cause-
Cohn-Bendit debate or in conversation with Sartre in front of a huge student audience.
Sartre yielded, you know. Sartre was very generous.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
Danny LaRouche.
Yeah.
he did tell him though, be careful of summer vacation because everybody will.
Yeah, he
Sartre
really
was
leave
very
town.
smart. I saw, you know, speaking of Sartre, there's a very nice interview with him on his balcony at Rue Raspail, you know, and he's out there and, yeah, Castor lives here. You know, Sartre's voice is great, you know, it's very rough and, you know, it's very, you know, you know, and he goes, and my daughter Arlette lives here. We're all very close. And the interviewer says, well, don't you feel upsetting that you're so close to the cemetery? I love the cemetery. What's going on? I walk through it every day. You know, he's going on. All my nearest family are right here. You know, he was phenomenal. I don't know if you've ever seen the footage of him when he was addressing the students of '68 about what a petite intellectual he was, bourgeois intellectual, and that the whole task was to always undo this petite bourgeois.
There's a
mentality.
brief clip of
There
that.
is of that, yeah.
Yeah,
It's
just
great.
very
It's great. He's
brief,
tweaking in the
9%.
microphone.
Yeah,
You know, you know, because in some ways, May of '68, one proposition you could use for a film, it is really the expression of Sartrean, you know, Sartrean freedom and spontaneity. You know, in some
Yeah.
ways, it was kind of this elevated moment that really just came all to a head as
Yeah.
a spontaneous uprising, even though a lot of it was programmed.
And it
the
illustrated
movement
the
of May,
limits of that
yes,
also.
and then
In
also the
interesting way.
limits of the
limits, yeah,
spontaneity.
because it-
Right.
It's like- it's
the
kind of like a shape,
Rosenbergist,
it's a waste.
the
It's-
Luxemburgist, Leninist moment, right? In a sense, plays out right there. You know?
Tito was very upset. This colleague of mine, who was the nephew of Sartre, he was a professor at Queens College for many years. He said he just wanted to go into the police headquarters and claim power, you know, and then start the
and the students
Tito,
said,
and then
"Well,
start
we
the
can't do
cleaning,
this.
you know.
We can't do
Start-
this." Yeah,
and
the
they said, "We
police
just
would
wanna make
welcome him.
love." They said,
Welcome.
"We want to make love. We don't
Right.
want power." And then the police were in the headquarters. They're marching past the headquarters with Sartre and everyone, and this guy Bendit, and the
Bendit,
police
yeah.
guards were saying to the students, come on in. There's nobody inside. If you want
Yeah.
to take over the police
Take it
headquarters."
over. We like you.
And the guy,
Yeah.
Bandit, he says, "We want to make love. We don't want power." And Tito's like,
Idiots.
like what?
Yeah.
And Sartre was basically like, you know, and the police guards were saying, then at least come in and burn the police files. The police were saying this.
Yeah.
Come and burn the
Yeah,
police
they
files.
understood.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure, of course.
Yeah.
That's how stupid these people were. These,
Yes,
these
absolutely.
students, the new left. You know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I
But they,
agree.
their whole thing was, well, we just want to be happy.
Well, it's like Michael said, like they didn't want power. They were
No.
afraid of it.
You're afraid of power.
Right.
Yeah.
They were
yeah,
afraid
right.
of it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
then
and
then it gets into sort of the commodification
Yeah.
of Danny, you know.
Well,
Oh, Danny, yeah.
Oh, he
revised
was
the
a joke. Yeah.
commodification of-
He wasn't really one of the big,
No, no.
guns. Yeah.
He was very articulate.
Yeah, very articulate. He had a kind of semi-charisma. He
Yeah.
was very good at the barricades. He knew how to stage. You know, they knew how to stage things.
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't
Right.
like Savio wasn't a stager in Berkeley. You know, Savio was the real deal in my opinion. Mario
Yeah.
Savio. He could speak, but he wasn't a hound for the media in a certain
No.
way. He knew how to
No,
speak.
he-
He knew how to speak to the moment. To
Yeah.
money.
I
For
mean,
those of
and
you who
he-
know, Mario Savio was one of the first people of the free speech movement in Berkeley, and you know, very articulate. Came from Brooklyn, died recently, unfortunately. You know, been great. There should have been a film about him, but you know, I guess.
think there was.
Is there a film about just about
free
Savio,
speech.
about free speech, but
Oh,
not
yeah.
about Mario himself?
Yeah,
but,
I
Not
mean,
about
they
Mario
have the-
himself.
yeah.
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 The clip of
Yeah.
him standing on the
Yeah.
On the police car, yeah.
You know,
Right.
saying there comes
Right.
a time when you know
Yeah.
the workings of the system become so odious, so noxious that you just have to throw yourself in the gears and
Right.
Make him stop.
make it
Yeah.
stop. Yeah.
And Sartre was very, very astute on this too. He understood if you didn't have the workers with you, there's no possibility. And he made a point of talking about that. He would use the code bilanco, you know, the factories. You know, he would always use that as a code
Yeah,
in a
there's
certain way.
great footage
you know.
of the students,
Yeah.
you know, going to their to the Citroën factory, I think, and the Renault factory, different, you know.
Well, Renault was where they killed the revolution ultimately.
Yeah, and they
killed.
they
Show that killing of the
pretty much, you know, where the
Pierre
was-
Ouveret.
the union leaders, you know.
Yeah, no,
basically
Ouveret
co-opted-
was assassinated. He was the Marxist of the group, the most
the plant.
intelligent at the plant itself. No, these are the people they killed. They killed, what's his name, Goldman, you know, friend of Sartre's, Pierre Goldman, Ouvrier at the Renault factory, you know, yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, they actually assassinated
No.
these people, and then there's a kind of you know, it's going around as a story now, and it used to be told sort of during the 70s about that. What's his name? Mersenne, the bank robber who escaped from the Laval high security prison twice in Montreal. Not once, but twice. And they made a movie of him. Mesrine is his name. And he went to Paris, and supposedly he was giving money, the bank robbery money, to the brigades, to the Rosa Brigado and other groups, and et cetera. And that's one of the reasons he was shot down by in a police action in '79. That ended the decade, was the assassination of Jacques Mesrine. Right, it was a well-known bank robber with his girlfriend too. They kidnapped a billionaire because he treated the wife who was infiltrating the household by being a housekeeper. They treated her like shit, so they finally said, we'll just kidnap him and get a ransom. They didn't get the ransom. That was one of the reasons they had to leave, Quebec. But anyway, all to say that you had all these kind of intrigues, and people forget the Janson network, 1960, was running guns to Algeria. This is Jean-Paul Sartre's, interlocutor and a member of the inner circle that has a gun running network, in a
That
way.
Guattari participated in, right?
Yes, he
He
was.
smuggled
Oh,
guns
yeah,
with
there was
his
smuggling,
car.
yes. Guattari
Across the
was
country.
the militant of the group with Deleuze. Deleuze had thought, but Guattari was an actor in the world, If Negre ever comes to the country, to the United States, if they ever let him in, he's been invited many times, but it would be great to get Negre before he dies. He's 82.
I don't think they'll ever
They're
let
not
him
going to
in.
let him in. But it'd be
Yeah.
great to talk to Negre about Guattari, because he knew you know, and loved Guattari. Yeah, yeah. This is the person that made Negre's escape possible from Italy and kept him in Paris. So you had all this. Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to seeing this because this is a period that I think was, this was our Dada moment in some ways. I
Yeah.
mean, it was the Dada of the 20th century for the generation of the 60s. You know,
It's
to
got some good
have
footage
that.
of the Czech
Prague Spring. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
but there's
Yeah,
always a
that turned
problem
out
with
to
the
be
Prague
pretty
Spring.
bad.
We
The
have to be
Velvet
careful with the
Revolution.
Prague Spring.
Very
like,
careful
Yeah.
with the
because
Velvet
there was a
Revolution.
strong, like, anti-communist liberal
Yes.
element in there.
And the Hungarian
Hungarian
uprising,
even
same
worse.
thing
Like
in
Nazi
'56.
collaborators were
Yeah.
part of the movement.
Yes, they were. Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
Well, they have this bizarre thing
It's a horrible
after
movement.
the
They have the Italian Autumn.
no.
No.
Okay, see that
No,
was
it's
another.
not complete like
Yeah.
you know
Some Portugal stuff.
And the Japanese, didn't they take some railroads out during the
No,
economy?
the-
They don't have any of that either. huh?
No, they don't have that either.
Yeah.
They don't have to take the Shinjuku
Yeah,
Station.
yeah, we weren't on the committee to make the film. Yeah.
Committee.
Yeah. No, but they did have, you know,
Yeah.
a fair amount of interesting stuff,
Yeah.
and
Vendita's, you know, a Green Party person, and you know, he's just basically
Yeah.
completely
well,
neutralized.
he's
for
a
many
member
years.
of the EU
Yeah,
Parliament.
yes.
Well, yeah, in the middle of the Prague Spring, the May '68, he realizes that basically the whole thing is going bust, that it's not going anywhere, and he's not making much money, and then a German company offers him 130,000 francs to do a history of the May '68. So he and his brothers sneak across the lines to Germany, put together something really quick so they can make a lot of money, and then sneaks back into.
I think he was smuggled out in Lacan's trunk. I think Lacan drove him across the border.
Yeah, they asked him, "How did you get across?"
What
the
did he say?
border?"
It was in the trunk, right, of a Jaguar. I think
I
Lacan took
think
him in
it
his
was-
Jaguar. I think that's the, you know.
They asked
You
him-
can see those two meeting too, I mean, in a certain
Yeah.
way.
They asked the
Yeah.
leading question, I think, did you
Yeah.
have to flee Germany?
Okay.
And he said, no, my father fled the Nazis from Germany, but
Uh-huh.
I'm coming back to where I live in
Right,
France.
right.
But,
I was born here.
yeah, right, but, no, but I mean, the fact that, you know, he saw the way things were going and figured, they needed to make a profit of it quick and, get a book out. And,
Well, he also he did this whole thing right after, like in June of '68. He did this spread in Match, you know. They
Oh yeah, it was commodified immediately.
Yeah,
I mean,
he-
you know,
he
the
was
real,
walking
the
around
real
Germany
people
with his
were,
suitcase,
yeah,
you know,
no, the real
and they were
people were
photographing
never,
him, you
never
know.
really on the
No.
front
Right,
pages.
right.
The people that really contributed to this, in a sense, you know,
Yeah.
and or the documents that were written and et cetera. And if you go back, you could look at La Chinoise again. Godard anticipates almost all of May of '68 in La Chinoise, the Chinese. Yeah, you can see the.
Yeah, they
the
really
building.
they
Did they talk about
there's a
Godard
line
at
in
all?
there where they really they call Godard a pig or something like that, you know.
Well, at that time, he was a Maoist. He was
Right.
beginning to be a Maoist. Yeah,
Right.
he went through a Maoist phase.
Right.
68, 69 until about 72, 73. Jean-Pierre Goron. And they did this film about America, too. You know, that was interesting, yeah. And he did 1+1 during that time, the making of Sympathy for the Devil, Mick Jagger. Where they had, it's very funny. He kind of pornographizes the relationship. Brezhnev and Nixon, doing voiceovers, pornography. It was kind of very, very interesting. And she met Brezhnev at the Hilton Hotel, and then you see Stalin, Hilton, anagrammatically, and so him flashing on the scene. Very, very creative. I mean, anyway. He's very good at signs. Yeah, okay, well, so I'm convinced to go see it. It's at Film Forum, right, for another week or so, yeah, a little less than a week, okay.
Yeah, it was funded by people at the Film Forum, actually.
Was it? They have money.
Yeah.
They have money, the Film
Yeah.
Forum, yeah.
Yeah, I think they're going to have a burst of activity before they shut down for 2 months.
Right.
Yeah.
But they have a great series, Bergman series, it's an amazing number of films. I had no idea how many films he
He does. He was a great
directed.
filmmaker.
They
Yeah.
seem like
No, he's an auteur, in the strong sense of the word.
Yeah, I saw
Yeah.
The Seventh Seal the other day.
You played chess with the devil.
It was wonderful. I had forgotten I don't think.
No,
I
it's a
really-
massive thinker. Yeah.
but,
No, he was
we'll
the
talk about-
Kierkegaard
Yeah.
of our era in
the
some
visual,
ways.
you know,
Yeah.
the scenes, but talk about movement towards death. I mean, that was.
Oh yeah, well, that was his obsession.
Imbricated
Yeah.
in this whole thing, but it was very funny too.
Yeah.
The night,
What was the
demonstrating
name?
each
The
other.
Scenes from a Marriage was very good, and then
Cries and
the one with Cries and Whispers, and of course the one Liv Ullmann plays the psychiatrist.
Persona.
Scenes from a Marriage.
Scenes from a Marriage, right? Scenes from a Marriage, and there was another one
Through a
too
Glass
that she
Darkly,
did. Which one?
Through a Glass Darkly.
Yeah, no, those are the earlier
The
ones.
ones in
Yeah, I'm
Persona.
trying.
Persona?
Persona's very early. No, there was one where Liz Ullmann is a shrink, and then she falls apart.
Yeah. I
one.
don't remember the
Persona.
title, but
No, it's after Persona.
not
So,
the
dude,
Magic Lantern or
no, I forgot the name of it, but it wasn't Coming Apart because that was the Rip Torn plays Coming Apart. That's kind of New York
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
Moses Allen Ginsberg made that. What's the name of that film with? Not Scenes from a Marriage. The Scenes from a Marriage was one, but there was one other. I'll look it up. I'll
Joseph.
remember. Yeah. Okay, so let's go back. I'll wait for Arto. So let's take a look at the note. So this note, right, is really on Hegel's concept of time, section 82, right? And maybe we should read through this a little bit, and then we'll look at the note. So turn to page 406. History, which is essentially the history of spirit, right, runs its course in time. And he's playing with, Hegel now, right? Thus, the development of history falls into time. But Hegel is not satisfied with establishing the within-timeness of spirit as a fact. Rather, he attempts to understand how is it possible for spirit to fall into time, which is the completely abstract, the sensuous. Time must be able to receive spirit, as it were, and spirit must in turn be related to time and its essence. Thus we must discuss two things. How does Hegel define the essence of time? And what belongs to the essence of spirit that makes it possible to fall into time? I'm telling you, Derrida's all 9 lectures are coming out of this in his book on being in history. Yeah. Okay, our answer to these two questions will serve merely to elucidate our interpretation of Dasein as temporality, and do so by way of a comparison. We shall make no claim even to give it a relatively complete treatment of the allied problems in Hegel, especially since we have no intention of criticizing Hegel. Because Hegel's concept of time presents the most radical way in which the vulgar understanding, vulgar meaning the crude interpretation of time, has been given form conceptually, and one that has received too little attention. The contrast of this concept with the idea of temporality that we have expounded is one that especially suggests itself. Okay? So he's going to try to, do a comparative thing about what he's been saying about the temporality as a horizon for being, right? And what he means by temporality with what he understands as the vulgar conception of time that begins all the way back with Aristotle and runs its course through Hegel. Okay?
He doesn't want to criticize Hegel.
But he doesn't want to
Carefully
criticize, right?
does not disturb
right.
too much.
Well,
of
he's
the-
very smart here because, yes, his concept of time, subsection A. The systematic place in which a philosophical interpretation of time is carried out only can serve as a criterion, so the topos becomes the criterion for understanding the basic guideline which leads the fundamental conception of time. The first traditional, thematically detailed interpretation of the vulgar understanding of time is to be found in Aristotle's Physics, in the context of an ontology of nature. Time is connected with location and with motion. True to the tradition, Hegel's analysis of time has its place in the second part of his Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, bearing the title the philosophy of nature. So you see Heidegger, nature and time, nature and temporality, fusus. The first division treats mechanics. Its first section is dedicated to a discussion of space and time. There are the abstract outside of one another. Although Hegel puts space and time together, this does not amount simply to juxtaposing them externally, space and also time. Philosophy fights against this also. The transition from space to time does not mean they are treating in adjoining paragraphs, but space itself goes over. Space is time, that is, time is the truth of space. According to Hegel, if space is thought dialectically, and this is very important, in what it is, this being of space reveals itself as time. How must space be thought? Okay, space is the unmediated indifference of nature being outside itself. And he's quoting Hegel, he's summarizing Hegel. This means that space is the abstract multiplicity of the points distinguishable in it. Right? Space is not interrupted by these points, but neither does it first arise from them by way of joining them together. Space differentiated by the differential points that are themselves in space remains undifferentiated. The differentiations themselves have the nature of what they differentiate. Nevertheless, the point itself, right, is a negation of space, that it differentiates something in space, though in such a way that itself remains in space as this negation. The point is, after all, space, again, right? The point does not lift itself out of space as something other than space. Space is the undifferentiated, outside one another, of the multiplicity of points. But space is not a point. It is rather, and this is interesting, as Hegel says, punctuality. Right? Punctuality, Zusatz. He has the German word at the bottom. This is the basis of the statement in which Hegel thinks space in its truth, that is, as time. So Hegel thinks space, first punctuality as space, right? As time. Okay? Mm-hmm. Very interesting. And then now he quotes Hegel. Negativity, which related itself as point to space, in which it develops its determinations as line and plane, is however in the sphere of self-externality, equally for itself in its determinations, but at the same time as it's positing in the sphere of self-externality. It appears as indifferent to that which is quietly side by side. Thus posited for itself, it is time. Okay? Now it's going to do a commentary on Hegel a little bit. If space is represented, okay, and this is what representation does, that is, it's immediately intuited, it's unmediated, immediately intuited, in the indifferent subsistence of its distinctions, the negations are, so to speak, simply given. But this representing does not yet grasp space in its being. That is possible only as in thought. And it's in thought as the synthesis that goes through thesis and antithesis and sublates them. Is and the is not, right here. Space is thought and thus grasped in its being only if the negations do not simply subsist in their indifference. But are sublated, that is, themselves negated. In the negation of the negation, and here's a definition of the negation as punctuality. Very interesting here. The negation of the negation, that is, punctuality, the point posits itself for itself, and thus emerges from the indifference of subsistence. Posited for itself, it distinguishes itself from this or that point. It is no longer this one, and not yet that one. In positing for itself, it posits the succession in which it stands. I emphasize the succession in which it stands, the sphere of being outside of itself, that is now the negated negation. Okay? He's really going through processes of the dialectic here. This is interesting that Heidegger understands this very, very deeply, right? Even though he is not a Hegelian dialectical thinker, he understands the thinking of Hegel very much from the inside out, because he's really describing here. I mean, I think this is a wonderful descriptive passage of the negation of the negation. Where we take as part of the dialectic, one chief element of the materialistic dialectic and the Hegelian-Marxist dialectic as the negation of the negation. Okay, let me go on. The sublation of punctuality as indifference signifies that it can no longer lie quietly, and this is Hegel's vocabulary, I love this, the paralyzed stillness of space. The point rebels against all other points. According to Hegel, this negation of negation as punctuality is time. Okay? As punctuality. Right? If this discussion has any demonstrable meaning at all, it can mean nothing other than that the positing of itself for itself of each point is a now hyphen here, a now here, and so on, so on. The now here. Right? Now is the night in which all the cows are gray in the phenomenology. Okay? So, every point is posited for itself as a now point. Thus, the point has actuality in time. That through which the point can posit itself for itself always as this point is always a now. The condition of the possibility of the point positing itself for itself is the now. This condition of possibility constitutes the being. And you can see he goes through this descriptively, analytically, and now he's looking at the conditions of which gives Hegel this kind of thought. Right? This condition of possibility constitutes the being of this point, and being is at the same time having been thought. Thus, since the pure thinking of punctuality, that is of space, always thinks the now, and the being outside itself of the nows, space is time. How is time, then, itself defined? So space is time in this first paragraph is the proposition, the predicate, right? Okay, as the negative unity of being outside itself, time is similarly something absolutely abstract and ideal. It is the being that in being is not, and in not being is, it is intuited becoming. This means that the absolutely momentary distinctions that immediately sublate themselves, I mean, that also could be, lift themselves to a higher plane, the Aufhebung he's really using here, sublation. She's translating Aufhebung as sublation, are determined as external, but external to themselves. Time reveals itself for this interpretation as intuited becoming. Intuited becoming. According to Hegel, this signifies a transition, this is interesting, from being to nothingness, or from nothingness to being. Okay? Being is coming into being as well as passing away. Being or non-being goes over. What does this mean with regard to time? The being of time is the now, but since every now, either now is no longer, or now is not yet, it can be grasped as non-being as well. Time is intuited becoming, that is, the transition that is not thought, but simply presents itself as a series of nows. If the essence of time is determined as intuited becoming, this reveals the fact that time is understood primarily in terms of the now, in the way that such a now can be found by sheer intuition. Okay? We do not need any complicated discussion to make it clear that in his interpretation of time, Hegel is wholly moving in the direction of the vulgar concept of time. Hegel's characterization of time in terms of the now presupposes that the now remains covered over and leveled down in its full structure so that it can be intuited as something present, even if it is only present as ideally, right? Or as an ideality. The fact that Hegel interprets time in terms of this primary orientation towards the now, and this is very important, again, towards the now, right, time, has been leveled down is proved by the following statement. This is Hegel. The now is enormously privileged. It is nothing but the individual now. But this now that is so proudly exclusive is dissolved, diffused, and turned to dust by my expressing it. Moreover, in nature, where time is now, no stable difference between those dimensions, past and future, ever comes about. In the positive sense of time, one can thus say that only the present is, the before and after are not, but the concrete present is the result of the past and pregnant with the future. Thus the true present is eternity. All right. If Hegel calls, right, intuitive becoming, neither coming into being nor passing away has priority. Okay? I'll read that again. If Hegel calls time intuitive becoming, neither coming into being nor passing away has any priority in it. Nevertheless, on occasion he characterizes time as the abstraction of consuming, which would be an interesting essay about the consumptive society, right? Time is the abstraction of consuming, right? To go through those levels, right? And thus formulates the vulgar experience and interpretation of time in the most radical way. On the other hand, when Hegel really defines time, he is consistent enough to grant no such priority to consuming and passing away as that to which the everyday experience of time rightly adheres. For Hegel can no more provide dialectical grounds for this priority than for the circumstance that he introduces as self-evident, that precisely when the point posits for itself, throws out for itself, the now turns up. So, when he characterizes time as becoming, Hegel understands this becoming in an abstract sense that goes beyond the representation of the flux of time. The most approximate expression for Hegel's conception of time thus lies in the determination of time as the negation of the negation, that is, of punctuality. Here the succession of nows is formalized as the most extreme sense and leveled down to an unprecedented degree. It is only in terms of this formal and dialectical concept of time that Hegel can produce a connection, going back to where he started, between time and spirit. Okay? So let's take a look at the footnote. Any thoughts about this? I mean, I know it's dense. It's worthy of times, but again, it is an attempted destruction by Heidegger of Hegel's concept of time fitting into the vulgar conception of time, and the footnote sort of begins to elucidate this, how this conception of time has crossed over, transversed the whole history of philosophy, beginning with Aristotle, and then the difference. So let's look at this. Okay, number 30, which is the note on the note. On being in time. You have the margins with you too, right?
Yes, I do.
You have the Gucia and Grammet, right? And the now. Okay. In terms of the priority of the now leveled down, it becomes clear that Hegel's conceptual determination of time also follows the course of the vulgar conception of time. Okay? Derrida will point this out in the beginning. This is how the narrative of this section, is begun. The ousia substance and the written trace is a note on a note and being in time. How does this play out? Right? And that means at the same time the traditional concept of time. So vulgar and traditional are akin to each other. You're going to look up margins here? You have it with you? You have it on Kindle?
Well, I have it on iBooks. I steal PDFs.
That's okay.
It's free.
That's
That's
better.
okay. Yeah, that's great. Okay.
It's easier to
So
move
let's take a
around.
look at this, okay? So we can now show that Hegel's concept of time is even drawn directly from Aristotle's physics. So he's merging, obviously, the vulgar conception of time with the ancient traditional sense of time that is articulated primarily in Book 4, Chapter 10 of Aristotle's Physics. Okay? Let's go on. In the Jensen logic, the Jena logic, 1923 publication, that was outlined at the time of Hegel's habilitation, the analysis of time in the encyclopedia is already developed in all its essential constituents. Right? The section on time reveals itself to even the crudest examination as a paraphrase of the Aristotelian treatise on time. Already in the Jena logic, Hegel develops his conception of time in the framework of the philosophy of nature. Its first part is entitled The System of the Sun. You know, and we can go back to this too and start reading all kinds of things into the allegory of the cave. And then why does Hegel talk of the system of the sun? You know, of course, astrologically, they're more advanced during this period. You know, you've had the Copernican turn, but, you know, still interesting that the sun plays out as a systemic, right? As you're going, whereas it's the governor back then, metaphorically at least. All right, following the conceptual determination of the ether and motion, Hegel discusses the concept of time. The analysis of space is still subordinate here. Although the dialectic already shows through, it does not have the later rigid schematic form, right? But still makes possible a more flexible understanding of the phenomena. On the way from Kant to Hegel's developed system, a decisive incursion of Aristotelian ontology and logic comes back about again. As a fact, this has been a long familiar, but the way, manner, and limits of his influence are just as obscure today. A concrete, comparative, and philosophical interpretation of Hegel's Jensen logic and Aristotle's physics and metaphysics will shed more light on this, new light. A few rough references will suffice for the above reflections. Okay? How does Hegel fit into this very traditional conception of time from Aristotle to him? Okay. Aristotle sees the essence of time in the nun, Hegel in the now. Aristotle conceives the nun as oros. Hegel interprets the now as limit. Aristotle understands the sun as stigma. This is point, right? Hegel interprets the now as a point, stigma and point. Aristotle considers the nun as tode ti, what is something, what is it? He calls the now the absolute is, right? The what is becomes the absolute this, right? Full determination. Aristotle connects Horus with Sophia, in accordance with the tradition. Hegel emphasizes the circular course of time. Of course, Hegel misses the central tendency of Aristotle. Of course, he misses the central tendency. I see it.
Because he's,
right?
he's a modern
I
thinker.
see it. Yeah. I see it. Aristotle's analysis of time, which exposes a foundational connection between the nun, the oros, the symphi, and the todies, right? Despite, right? Okay, so the connection here is that you really want to know what time is in the traditional sense and how this vulgar concept of time in the now is done and how we get to the negation of the negation. You better start reading Aristotle's physics, right? I mean, it's basically the message here, you know? You really want to understand
Because the
this.
Hegelian conception is like an inferior summary of.
In some ways it
Aristotle.
is. It is.
That's
It's
what
a
Heidegger
reworking of it, right? In many ways, right? Yeah. You have to tell Peter that. He'll become, give the Greeks in there.
Greek
Oh,
nationalist.
yeah. Maybe you're right. Maybe Heidegger's on to something. Okay. Despite all differences in justification, and now he goes to Henri Bergson, conception agrees with Hegel's thesis that space is time. Bergson just turns it around. This is important. Time is space. Now, Deleuze writes a book on cinema based on his Bergsonian background and Bergsonian's thesis about movement. And what are the two books called? Time image and movement image. Time image, not space image, right? But time image and movement image, right? Okay, Bergson's interpretation of time, too obviously, grew out of the interpretation of Aristotle's treatise on time. Again, Heidegger's going to say our next course will be on Aristotle's physics, and we will see all this at work, right? Right? It is not just a matter of an external literary connection that simultaneously with Bergson's essay on the immediate givens of consciousness, where the problem of time and duration is expounded. A treatise of Bergson's appeared with the title, what Aristotle meant about motion and sense. With regard to the Aristotelian definition of time as aprimos, kinesthesis, kinetic, movement, right? Bergson analyzes the number of movements, right, is Aristotle, arithmos, kinesthesis. Bergson analyzes number before analyzing time. Time as space is quantitatively succession. It's quantitative succession, not qualitative, quantitative.
Mm-hmm.
Duration is described on the basis of a counter orientation towards this concept of time as qualitative succession. This is not the place for a critical discussion of Bergson's concept of time and other present-day interpretations of time. To the extent that anything essential has been gained at all beyond Aristotle and Kant, the concern is more with grasping time and time consciousness. And time consciousness is obviously a reference to Husserl's phenomenology of internal time consciousness. But referring to the direct connection of Hegel's concept of time and Aristotle's analysis of time, we do not intend to charge Hegel with being dependent, but to point out the fundamental ontological import of this affiliation for Hegel's logic. On Aristotle and Hegel, compare this essay with the title of Hartmann's in the contribution to the philosophy of German idealism. All right? So this ends the famous footnote, right? And time as spirit. You want to say a little bit about what he does with it?
Okay, well.
Because it's a note on a note.
It's a long note on the note. It's 10 times more than
The note.
the note.
Of course.
He says it's only a footnote, but it is by far the longest in being and time, pregnant with developments that are announced and held back, necessary but deferred. We will see it already, that it already promises the second volume of Being and Time.
That's true.
But it
We've
does,
said that.
what?
We've said that here. Yeah. No, go ahead. No, please.
But that it does so, we might say, by reserving the second volume, both as something still to be unfolded and as definitive enveloping the first. You want me to summarize this?
Yeah, just tell me where you think he's going with this, because, he seems to say that ultimately that this notion of time, that Heidegger's on to something, of course, and, that the putting to task of the traditional and the vulgar is not the worst thing in the world, but he says that there's still a nostalgia here, ultimately he calls it Heideggerian hope. Right? Yeah,
He
please.
says
Yeah,
that
yeah.
the now,
Right.
as we understand it, whether it's Aristotle or Hegel, has to be understood as the present.
Right.
It's not the past, which is the now that has been, or the future, which is the now that's not yet.
Right.
But what Derrida adds is the present tense. It is the present that we understand from language. So it's the present, but Heidegger can't evade the issue of language and the present tense. The is. What is the meaning of being?
Okay.
Heidegger can't avoid that present tense in that question. Gee, this is 30 pages. So.
No, it's okay. I mean, you're doing a great job because you present the now in terms of what ultimately will be called the Anwesen, right? The intuitive becoming becomes present, right? the essence or the becoming essence of something, right, becomes the present, the Anwesen. He's taking this on as the now. And the collapsing of time and space is happening in the present tense.
Let
And
me
the
read a
parfait,
little.
yeah, sure. Okay.
And this is Derrida. An
Okay, yeah, yeah.
enormous task is proposed here. The texts pointed out are doubtless among the most difficult and most decisive of the history of philosophy. So feel better, you know.
Well, yeah, we're not taking on small potatoes here.
And yet, is not what Heidegger designates beneath these points of reference that which is most simple, not only self-evident, but the very milieu, the element of self-evidence outside of which it seems that thought itself must suffocate? Has not the entire history of philosophy been authorized by the extraordinary right of the present? Have not meaning, reason, and good sense been produced within this right, and also that which joins ordinary discourse to speculative discourse? Hegel's in particular. How could one think being and time otherwise than on the basis of the present, in the form of the present, to wit, a certain now in general from which no experience by definition can ever depart? The experience of thought and the thought of experience have never dealt with anything but presence. Thus, for Heidegger, it is not a question of proposing thinking that which could not have been, not thought, and otherwise. There is produced in the thought of impossibility or the otherwise, in this not otherwise, a certain difference, a certain trembling, a certain decentering that is not the position of the other center. And I'll stop there.
So, I mean, you think he's saying that what Heidegger has done here is a massive decentering operation in the history of philosophy, but he is presupposing that there's such a thing as the present tense, or that there's the present,
Saying
always,
the whole
already?
history
The whole history, yeah, well, of course.
Western
yes, right.
philosophy is based on the privileging of the present
Right,
tense,
right.
and Heidegger is no exception.
Right, okay. And what would you think of that? I mean, yeah. Do you think Heidegger's wrong in terms of his thinking of time?
I think Derrida's right.
And what would be the counter to this? That we still are bound by the past? Or because Heidegger is always saying that, the major temporal category, the temporal ecstasies, is always a play between past, present, and future, and that presence itself is again this kind of notion of the Vorhanden, right? The present to hand is leading towards objectivity, and that what he's really trying to do is catapult us or decenter us away from this vulgar and traditional sense of time towards the future. That everything is futural now.
Derrida makes his own play with the
Fair enough.
word
Yeah. I'm just playing.
maintenant, which is now in French, maintenant. But maintenant uses the word
Has hand in it.
M-A-I-N, which is the
Hand.
word for hand.
Hand.
So
Ready
now
to hand.
includes the word for hand.
Ready to hand, yes.
So he
But that's
plays on-
very Heideggerian, though, isn't it?
Well, he plays on Heidegger. I think he's
Well, he likes
he's
to play.
teasing
Oh, he's
Heidegger.
teasing him? Okay.
It's a French kind of teasing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So the stake here, I mean, just to be careful about this moving forward, And, you know, I mean, I think it's a very rigorous reading of Derrida. I mean, no question about it. I mean, by Derrida, Heidegger's, you know, note on a note, and it's clever and all this. But it seems like the stake here is the one of the history of Western philosophy as a history of presence, right? Everything that comes out of the conceptual apparatus of Western philosophy, such as reason, terms such as enlightenment, all of this are the result of, you know, the thinking of time as present and the present tense. Is that adequate
Yeah.
summary? Huh? Okay. Yeah.
He says that in a note, in his own footnote, he says.
Derrida's own footnote or Heidegger?
Derrida's
Okay.
footnote. The difference between finite and infinite is proposed here as the difference between the now, that's German now, and the present, that's the German present. Pure presence, infinite parousia, that's
Parousia, yeah.
parousia,
Right.
according to Hegel, then would be governed by the now, which Heidegger tells us limits and determines parousia from physics and the encyclopedia. But since Heidegger also questions the privilege of the Gegenwart, here we ought to delve into the deliverance between, into the differences between Jetzt, Gegenwart, Anwesenheit.
Right. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, no, I know these terms.
Well, that, I can stop there.
No, it's okay. Go ahead if you want. Gegenwart, right?
Jetzt,
Anwesenheit
Gegenwart,
is present,
Anwesenheit.
right? You know.
The German just undoes me.
It does, yeah.
Again, under the rubric of preliminary survey, let us be satisfied here with translating Hegel's text, and then he goes on to Hegel's text.
Okay, so we end up as a problem both in grammatical tense, right, as well as a problem of translation, right, both.
And substance.
And substance, right. And ousia, as you know, right, literally means ousia, means substance. And parousia means outside of substance, right? And also this has a connection to the temporality of eternity. Right? The parousia. Right?
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. It's in the New Testament, by the way.
The New Testament.
What's the Derrida text?
Yeah.
What is it?
It's a note on being in time, from Margins in Philosophy,
It's
of Philosophy.
Margins
of
of
Philosophy.
Philosophy.
So he's reading, you know, you're getting an example of how Derrida reads in the margins, right? You're getting a very good example with Chris's reading of how he'll take a conceptual chain, right? He'll build around that and then try to deconstruct, right? So it's interesting, right? This is,
Intense,
he'll
yeah.
take a little footnote, right, or a letter. This is part of what he does, right? And then he'll build a whole argument, if you will, around this by looking at the chains of reasoning. So he'll use a whole chain from Gegenwart to the play of presence, Anwesenheit, present scene, etc. And then he'll take this on in the grammatical sense, right? Because it's about grammatization, the gramme, the writing, and also the grammatization and what tense are we dealing with. And can we get to the ideal, you know, quote unquote, present parfait, right? Is there such a thing as the perfect present, right? In a way. So in some ways, when I said, and I think I probably misspoke, I know I got a little, when I did the structural, the future parfait is the tense of maybe where Heidegger wants to go, right? In some ways, according to Derrida, or what Derrida says is impossible. But I would claim, I mean, you know, in some ways, it's more of this that's operating anterior, right? The future anterior, the future's past, right, that is operative
Will
here.
have been.
Yes, and the will have been, yes. And the having been that we talked about last week and the week before, the having beenness of Dasein, right? Vis-a-vis stuff. So, I mean, this is very interesting. You get a sense of how Derrida will work in the margins of the text, right? He's going to take chains of reasoning. He's going to take on as you said, he imports the whole history of Western philosophy, beginning with Aristotle, right, going through Hegel, and then tries to say that Heidegger is going to interrogate this from the standpoint of these crucial terms, right, that Derrida himself is going to try to deconstruct as he goes forward, right, and then ultimately he will say that this is a nostalgia. If you read the end, maybe you should read, can you go to the end? It's a beautiful
The end of
passage.
the-
Yeah, it's a beautiful passage.
He thinks that's
Yeah.
nostalgia.
I didn't get there.
Oh, you didn't get there?
But I'll
Okay.
I don't
read
think
from
so.
it.
Yeah. What did you say?
I don't know about that.
Yeah, no, I don't either. Yeah, I don't either. Yeah. You know, these are Germans with,
He thinks that future
translating
inferior-
German metaphysics and ontology into French deconstruction sometimes can be an arduous task.
It's
Yeah.
intense, though.
Anyway, yeah.
Henceforth,
But it is intense, yeah.
it must be recognized that all the determinations of such a trace, all the names it is given, belong as such to the text of metaphysics
Right.
that shelter the trace, and not to the trace itself. Or as he said in The Ends of Man, he
Yes.
said, all of you at this conference are metaphysicians.
Yes.
You're actually anthropologists. Which I assume shocked them.
Yes. Still shocking them.
They didn't
Still,
applaud.
we have members of our own group, like Bruno Gulli, still shocked
Yeah,
by
that's
this.
true. That is true.
We'll
There
tease
is
Bruno
no-
tomorrow. Yeah.
There is no trace itself, no proper trace. Heidegger
Okay,
indeed
let me
says.
just stop you for a second. The trace itself, I'm sorry, but I just want to
Yeah,
say,
okay.
the trace is basically where you do such things as you play out the chain of the term, right? You're tracing that in the text, but at the same time, there's a historicity at work that traces the tradition, right? So that this can be undone and deconstructed, right?
It has a lot of meanings
Yes.
that maybe I shouldn't bring up.
No, it's okay,
but
you can bring them up.
Freud in The Scene of Writing.
Yes, of course.
Where the trace is the violent trace on the gray matter of the brain.
Right.
And he uses the children's toy.
The mystic writing pad, the
little-
Wunderblock.
Do you remember
the
a little
Wunderblock.
writing
The
pad
Wunderblock.
was black and you pulled up a piece of paper and you wrote something, and when you pulled the paper off,
The Wunderblock,
it
yeah. They
disappeared.
call it the Wunderblock. Yes, the magic writing pad.
Yeah.
My kid says when he draws, because he's 3.5, he says, he looks at this book because I was reading, so he comes over, he says, read the words. So I start reading the words, and then I turn the page and he says, but where did the words go? So he
That's
pushes-
exactly what Derrida's
Then
talking
he pushes
about.
back the page and he
trace
says,
and
read
erasure.
the words. You know?
Go ahead.
Like
Yeah.
these words. You
No,
know?
good.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Chris. You're doing great.
It's
Yeah.
still, the words are still there somewhere
It's
in
very
that.
intense. He's like, read these same words again. You know.
Tell
So-
them that they're buried in the,
So, Chris, go ahead. You're doing great. I mean, on this trace thing. That's good. That's very good.
well,
Yeah.
this is the last paragraph.
Okay, okay.
That you
You don't want
asked
to
me
say any more about the trace?
Heidegger indeed says the difference could not appear as such, and then he has it in German. Illumination of the distinction therefore cannot mean that distinction appears as distinction. The trace of the trace, which is difference, above all, could not appear or be named as such, that is, in its presence. It is the as such which precisely and as such evades us forever. Thereby, this determinations which name difference always come from the metaphysical order. This holds not only for the determination of difference as the difference between present and the present, but also for the determination of difference as the difference between being and beings. If being, according to the Greek, forgetting, which would have been the very form of its advent, has never meant anything except beings with the S, then perhaps difference is older than being itself. There may be difference, still more unthought, that difference between being and beings. We certainly can go further toward naming it in our language. Beyond being and beings, the difference ceaselessly differing to be the first or last trace, if one could speak here of origin and end. Such a difference would at once again give us to think of a writing without presence, without absence, without history, without cause, without archaea, without telos. Writing that absolutely upsets all dialectics, all theology, all teleology, all ontology, a writing exceeding everything that the history of metaphysics has comprehended in the form of Aristotelian gramme, in its point, in its line, in its circle, in its time, in its space.
Pretty good, huh?
Yeah, that's amazing.
Man, that's the new novel, right there. That's the novel of the future, right there.
That's the radical project of the future.
Yes, that's right. No, that's
In
good.
thought.
Okay, thank you, David. Yeah, okay.
That's true.
Right?
We have a lot of work to do.
We do have a lot. Yeah. But it's interesting how this operates, right? How he sees this.
Yeah.
Derrida sees this in terms of still being entrapped, if you will, within the history of Western metaphysics. That somehow Heidegger cannot exceed that project.
He can't go beyond
and that
Aristotle.
we need something
In a
outside.
certain
Yeah.
sense.
We can't get outside of that except by a new kind of writing of the future, right? That has not yet come to be, right? In a sense. Yeah, so this is the kind of interesting thing about this. Now, of course, Derrida is writing this during a period where there's an enormous amount of experimental writing going on, including Philippe Sollé's Numbers, which is a play somewhat, on the Chinese ideogram and numbers in Western mathematics. So, you have all these kind of forces at work, during this period when he's actually writing this. But it's very interesting. You can get an idea of how Derrida operates with the highest powered, philosophical text that he is going to engage right here, and what he does in the margins of this, right? Now, our question is, does Heidegger have the tools? Does he give us enough tools to really think the future and, anticipate the future with a kind of vocabulary that still has the existential analytic? Are we going to leave that behind, or is that just a metaphor? Are we just metaphorics? Are we just writing machines? Are we both in part of the cybernetic project, or are we more? These are questions we can raise around this, right? Is this new grammatology part of the cyber, age, right? And
I
going
think
forward.
Heidegger,
Yeah.
in his book, feels that he can't accomplish it.
No, I agree. Yeah.
And I think maybe Stiegler is trying to
Yes.
address this question.
No, it's a good point. I think you're right about that. Yeah. Yeah.
Who doesn't have the same machinery as Heidegger.
No, he
It's
doesn't.
not on the same level.
No. No. But Stiegler is trying in terms of a new
Yeah.
new adventure when he sees the cybernetic project and
Right.
digitalization and what you call homo datum at work, right? That we begin to see this, that there's no more epistemology, there's only data and interpretation of data.
Maybe
and when you
Badiou
listen
is-
to people constantly speaking, they speak in terms of data, statistics. You look at the market decline, all the language is about data.
course.
It's not about multiple determinations of what may have caused. There's no dialectical approach, much less a Heideggerian hermeneutical approach to the way this is going on, even among the economists, the best people out there, right?
Even among the Marxist economists.
The worst. The worst. You know the joke, huh? You know the joke, huh? The Marxist economists have predicted 26 of the last three recessions.
Right.
That's how good their models are.
The guys from Peary.
Yeah. Naomi Prinz knows her stuff, though. It's a shame she's not in New York anymore.
Who?
She used to work at Goldman Sachs. Naomi Prinz.
Oh no.
Yeah. Have you heard her speak? She's
Yeah.
good. She's very
Yeah, she
smart.
is good.
Very smart. She's an
Wait,
ex-Goldman Sachs person.
Yeah.
Made enough money so she could just write. She moved out
Well,
to
she
the
was-
West Coast. She was living here. It's
She
a
was
shame.
exiled from Goldman.
Yeah, she was exiled, of course. Yeah.
So Stiegler takes
Yeah,
a
yeah.
Derridian perspective ultimately in the end of this essay and says that technology is this new kind of writing.
Well, let me just do it this way. I mean, maybe this will help a little bit. Look, if you think of being as time, right? And you try to do, we'll go into this next week more, right? And you begin to say there's time is really epochal, right? You're really dealing with epochal time. You're not really dealing with periodization, or calandrial, clock time, datability, and all of this. You're dealing with epochs, right?
Right.
So you can have the epochal time. And for Heidegger, being as the one is the first epoch. That's the ancients, from the pre-Socratics through Plato and Aristotle. Being as nature, natura, that's the Roman period up through the Middle Ages, maybe to Spinoza in some ways. You could maybe articulate that, as nature. And then being as, in our epoch, again, as self-consciousness, right? Which is the Hegelian, first of all, the Cartesian moment, right? Which is, obviously, the self is constituting, the subject is constituting the objects and reflecting on the objects, and the beginning of egoology, and the ego, the birth of the ego. And then we still live in this, and we're on the cusp, on the transition. And then along comes, so this is history, right? History of being, in a way, right? If you want to call being God, if you want to call being energy, I like saying, being is energy, right? And it's the equation, right, in a sense. So you see a whole epoch being defined about the thinking of the one. This is a concept. This collapses, in the next transition. Instead of reading ancient society, feudal society, and modernity, you can do this like the Marxists do in history, and class struggle. You're seeing the struggle of, the conceptual, right? But in its materiality and the movement, right? So anyway, along comes, say, people such as Derrida, right? And they say, well, Heidegger himself will put this under erasure, right? The being, right? And ultimately say there's only lowercase beings. So this kind of, upsets this kind of reading of temporality, right? And the history of temporality.
Yeah.
But at the same time, why don't we start with, we're just here all the time. We're in this, becoming,
Right.
historical becoming always as a process, being as process. But you could also say you still have being as processing of the one here. So you can go back and forth, right? In some way, being as the process of nature naturing, or as nature,
So Derrida takes the Heraclitus position over Parmenides.
I think, that's one way of looking at it. I think you would look at both, because they're both, again, part of the Western tradition, but the Heraclitean, all things are in flux, is much more of a Marxist deconstructive move, right, than it is, quote unquote, the attempted unity by Heidegger, who tries to bring together, I know you're reading Introduction to Metaphysics,
Already.
but the metaphysical question, is then being and becoming. Why are they things that exist versus why does something not exist? The old is not, but at the same is and is not, but also the predicate of becoming. We're always in this process of flux, right? Versus that of the being of the logical contradiction. And then you set up a kind of old category, stasis and dynamis, right? Which again is Aristotelian. Stasis in the Greek means civil war. So this may be where we are in some ways, you know, right now,
Today, yeah.
right? You know, stasis, right, etc. Right? So
Okay.
the question is being as stasis or being as dynamis as well, right? In terms of the design. Now the question again here is how does one read, right? And how does one interpret, right? And in a way, and Derrida will go to the margins, right? And look at this and say, okay, let's trace this term, you know, in its incarnations and its usage throughout time and what gyrations and movements will it go through, right? And at the same time try to show the becoming at work, but then the times that the tensions exist between these two.
I see.
Heidegger would do the same thing in a different way, in a different way.
Yeah.
And have to remember that deconstruction as a word means to undo, to unbuild. How was this built? Because once you're doing deconstruction, you're looking at how something's constructed. One reason I emphasized the section on understanding, right? To take control of something, right? To be there, right? Etc. So you're always in this process of how something is constructed, and then how do you undo that construction, do deconstruct it, right? So it's not only the deconstructive maneuver that is at stake, it's also what's been phenomenally reduced, constructed, and deconstructed. And then ultimately how you begin to problematize, whether it's through the Derridian moment of where you begin to look at the margins of writing, you propose this, you know, the new novel, right? The radical, you know, Thomas Pynchon part, you know, 50 times magnified or whatever, Gravity's Rainbow, if you will, right? In terms of that kind of deconstruction. And, you know, remember, they're reading people like Joyce, they're reading Gottisolo, they're reading surrealist literature, they're reading experiments in all of this, experiments with language. You know, Faulkner's goal was to make everything into the present tense in one sentence. He said this about his work. His goal as a writer was to make everything in the present tense, to be able to write the present, right? In a way. So, okay, and speaking of the present, just to go to that other French philosopher, historian in a way, Foucault says the reason we do archaeology, you know, is we want to do an archaeology of the present. So by going back to these kind of things in Aristotelian time, where do we get clock time from? If not from point, line, stigma, etc., right? How do we get clock time without punctuality and space, right? So you begin to think of all the things that he's programming here, that Derrida, by the way, lives out of his essay, right? I mean, you know, because again, if you read it fully, you begin to see that he's leading up to this traditional and vulgar concept of time that has a kind of retro, you know, a reflective capacity to earlier in the section on temporality. So you're asking the question, yes, doesn't the traditional concept of time give us datability, calandrial time, chronological time, all these kind of moments, right? So we have to think this through in terms of how that's constructed. And then what are we going to do when we undo it, right? The Abao. So for Foucault, the archaeology of knowledge, right, is going to go back and look at principles, right? And also dig up, unearth, right, what was happening, but he's really doing an archaeology of the present. You know, he's trying to read the present time through what we had in the past. No accident he goes back and reads Kant's What is Enlightenment after May of '68. Right? No accident, because he wants to talk about, you know, after a revolution, you know, you have to have a revolution in thinking, etc. So I don't know if this makes sense. And in between this, you could start thinking of ontology, you know, the history of being, if you will, or the history of ontology, right? As something like, you know, this new history, something like Marx. Where's Marx in here? Well, it would be being as value. You know, how do we come to learn value? Many people cannot explain value in Marx. They can say there's use value and there's exchange value, but what is value? What is value form, right? How does value itself make itself? So this becomes a kind of question of the being of value. In Nietzsche, the being of power. What ultimately is power? So this is another thing. Freud, being as desire, right? What is this desiring subject? So you can begin to do these kind of ontologies off of this in terms of just a quote-unquote postmodernity, if you will, and post-structuralist readings of a kind of more epochal sense of time. Yeah. So again, it's a question of the way we do history, right? Well, we'll talk more about this, and maybe we should finish here. You know, the way we do history, right? What is the history of the concept? How do you undo this? And what Derrida is doing, he's setting up chains. I mean, he's brilliant at this. Absolutely brilliant. His attunement to the gestalt, right, to the figure of these concepts, how they play out in the text, and where they're located in the writing machine, you know, that's happening. And what kind of regimes do they play to? And, you know, do we really have full presence ever? No. But I don't know if Heidegger's really claiming this. That's another question, you know, going forward, right? Right? Maybe we attain to that. Maybe that's part of the anticipation, you know? Yeah. So this would be an interesting question, right? So one is, how do we write, right? Derrida. You know, how do we write the future, if you will? The other one is, how do we think it? And, you know, the task to me would be, how do you put the two together? The thinking and the writing, right?
Yeah.
Even though Derrida does, but I mean, in my opinion, and I mean, I'm not criticizing him, I'm just saying, I don't think he really gets to the point of where he does more than the deconstructive maneuvers.
Yeah.
The prescription is not there,
Right.
right? Yeah, the prescription is not there, right? So, yeah, the ethics of deconstruction is a responsibility to the text, right? And all of it, you know, this is really its gift, you know, that he picks up from Hippolyte, you know, obviously earlier on.
Right.
Hippolyte is not a deconstructionist, but, you know, it does not, you know, really engage this, but they pick up that kind of sensitivity to textual analysis. A different level than we had in the United States with all this new criticism and Northrop Frye and this kind of things, and Maud Buck and archetypes and literature and all this stuff. So the question is there a prescription here? How do we think? You know, what is the prescriptive? You know, going forward? And script, of course, is part of writing, right? Yeah, descriptive, prescriptive, right?
Yeah.
Are all part of the writing machine. You know, these are all terms of writing, right? Yeah. So this is the main, yeah. So I mean, Heidegger would maybe, if he was here, would say, you know, you can take one saying of the ancients and meditate at that on your whole life, and still not, you know, I mean, this is what he would reply in a certain way, you know, and, you know, he does have this encounter. I mean, the more I read of his relationship, Letter on Humanism, reading between the lines, Heidegger's really making a call to a kind of non-humanistic reading of Marx. He's in some ways really anticipating the structuralist Althusserian move, which is against humanistic readings. The incredible amount of power there in 47, right? Right? So Derrida comes out of this. I mean, again, you know, remember, Derrida has the good fortune of 1947 having happened, right? 1968 on the ends of man, right? The ends of anthropology, which Heidegger has already done, 27, right? 61 years earlier, right? He's already taken care. We went through this.
Yeah.
Anthropology, biology, the other disciplines, etc. But he comes back to this. But then he has the advantage, ultimately, of the Letter on Humanism to be basically talk about, right, a kind of non-humanistic writing machine.
That letter was
right.
known.
Yeah.
It was read.
Very much. This guy was a friend of Derrida's, and they knew each other very well. Repressed Catholic. Jean Bouffret. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. Collaborator too.
Oh.
Issue. Right. This was the front man. This is the one that commissioned the Letter on Humanism. Take care of the atheistic, humanistic Sartre. You can hear them on the phone. It's upsetting everybody. He's becoming the father of French existentialism as a communist, right? I mean, or as a Marxist. You know, they can hear it. You can hear the rumblings, right? Right. So he writes Letter on Humanism, you know, as a way of saying, no, this is not a humanism, but Marx maybe not be a humanist either. Yeah, in some ways, yeah. And you have to remember, there are many Marxists, too. I I mean, Marx, the mature Marx, is not really quote unquote, I mean, he's always thinking activity and revolutionary activity, but he's not as involved in the day-to-day operations. He's doing theory from 1867
He's in the
till
library.
in the library till 1881, 1883. You know, he's in the library 16 straight years or more in London, right? With a few meetings with the IWW and
That's why the
Yeah.
center of gravity, it seems like, for Marxist sort of politics,
Right.
shifts from Marx to Lenin and Gramsci. I mean,
Right,
that's-
of course.
But
Yeah.
a lot of Marxists don't. They still get stuck on just political economy, and they don't understand that the next significant step was Lenin and Gramsci, and sort of the movement of
Well, it's
Marx
no
as a
accident that
political,
Lenin is studying Hegel. I mean, how accurately is another thing. But Derrida makes this point, and I think this is another thing that's very important for us to keep in mind, and I try to do this, that's why I mention a lot of things here, is the process of intertextuality. Lenin is reading Marx. What level is he reading Marx? In what level is he orienting Marx to his thought? These are all questions of the text, right, that Derrida has opened up in terms of this deconstruction. You know, he's a
But
real,
how the
there are
text also
serious questions. right?
becomes harnessed in
Yes,
the actual
of course,
praxis,
of
which is
course.
even more important.
Of
right?
course,
Like-
yes, right. Well, the practice is also involved in the textual work.
Right, right.
There's a textual practice
reading, the
alongside
interpreting.
of quote unquote the political activists, what we normally see in our
How
kind
to
of
read the
American
text
pragmatic
politically, yeah.
eyes, this
Yeah.
distinction between theory and practice, or all this. So yeah, there's a textual practice always already going on. Yeah, right. And this is something that has been lost during the last 20 years. I mean, Chris was fortunate enough to have teachers, that had that kind of, ability, right, to read text. We don't have this in the schools so much anymore. We really don't. I mean, I look at the English professors here, they're not doing this kind of stuff. Not even close, not even close to this. And it was a moment, it was a great moment, right, in some ways, but it's seen its day in some ways. It's gone underground, right? It happens here on Saturdays or somewhere, else or around the country, right? I mean, people still reading this stuff and engaging in it, but it's not part of everyday culture, right, anymore. It's not a part of everyday culture. And everybody's looking for the new. The art world's the worst on this, but everything's looking for the new, right? Everything's and what's the new? It's Badiou. Badiou is the new, right? And for some of the people downtown. So then the question is, then none of them understand him. None of them have the depth of the thinking around this. And then secondly of all, I mean, how can one really read Badiou seriously without knowing this? Some of those essays, or at least seminal essays that are out. You don't have to read all. I mean, it's impossible to read everything they ever wrote and cross-reference everything. But on the other hand, to know the foundational texts that are being operative. Badiou mentions 13 philosophers by name as anchoring points by proper name in the book being as an event. Right. Yeah, Derrida can do a whole essay just on the name Hegel and Eagle. Hegel and Hegel, right? He does, he'll do this, and the imperialism of the American eagle. See, this is the kind of stuff that went on, that kind of semiotics, etc. Right? It's not the Declaration of Independence; it's the declarations of independence. He does a reading of that as well. So this is something that has, come in, I mean, in a way that has been, at least to my mind, and I think this can be backed up by practice, or we wouldn't be so stupid. It's been suppressed, censored, and written sort of out of the curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is what's going on constantly. Yeah. Whereas if we're talking this way in the 70s, it's all fresh. I mean, I remember going to Great Expectations bookstore. My first copy of Margins of Philosophy, hardbound. $11. I thought it was a small fortune, but I paid it. $11 in Evanston, Illinois, and reading it. Who is this guy? I mean, I knew about him from Johns Hopkins, but I remember the first time I bought the copy of this book and looked at it, etc. What are the you think about the margins, and going back to Bakhtin, the marge, right, and is actually the fools in the marketplace. Socrates is part of the Magritte. It's interesting. Yeah. And he writes an essay on to tympanize, is to ridicule. That's what philosophy does. It ridicules. So there's a whole thing on tympanizing. That's a very great collection of his work. Yeah. I mean, he has the standard stuff like the lectures, the early works, Genesis, and, I mean, to move a little bit to Derrida, yeah. But again, I don't see how it's possible to read Derrida without a working knowledge of Heidegger, and
For
then
sure.
to another degree Husserl, and to me, to my mind, as a philosopher, maybe as a literary figure, and to take out concepts and apply them, etc. But as a philosopher, which he liked to call himself, and he considered himself, from what I understand, a phenomenologist to his dying day. This is, Derrida. A radical
Well, see, but that's
phenomenologist.
the thing about philosophy is that,
Yeah.
which a lot of mathematicians that I know don't
Mhm.
understand, is that there's a chain of causality in the arguments and the layers that must be all understood in order to understand the next significant
Chain of
layer.
reasonings.
Chain of
Yeah,
reasonings, yeah.
yeah.
So, like, you can't understand Derrida without understanding Heidegger. You can't understand Heidegger without reading Aristotle and Hegel and Descartes, and or you can understand it but not
Yeah,
fully.
I mean, look,
and-
again, this
but in
is an
political
attempt,
science, you can
but-
understand, anything.
Voter
because-
patterns.
Yeah, because they're just floating ideas that are
Yeah.
stitched together.
Yeah, I
and they're
understand.
meaningless.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
In math, you need this kind of chains too. But math is a branch of philosophy if we follow, the
Right.
ancients.
I mean, with Derrida, you have to ask the question: what was the changes that happened to him early on that produced this kind of massive writing machine and all these deconstructive maneuvers, which was basically a thought war machine. I mean, this is guerrilla warfare. I mean, in a way, it's really guerrilla warfare. I don't know if I'm explaining it well, but it is part of a guerrilla war machine here that's operative. Yeah, in a
Just throwing
sense. I mean,
bombs from the jungle.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the Viet Cong fighting back.
There was a
at a
writer-
certain level.
Yeah.
I mean, he is very well aware of the political. He doesn't directly say, it's the U.S. government, it's imperialism. He doesn't use these kind of terms. But he knows very well from the position of the margin, the position of those that are on the margins. This is where he's trying to go. What's been forgotten in the text of both philosophy, literature, or in any texts.
The writer
Yeah.
Bulgakov has this incredible quote. He says about the staying power of guerrilla warfare in thought. He says a hand grenade explodes only once, and it sort of expends its energy. But a subversive book can explode infinite amount of times.
Of course, I'm going to use that at the unit. Everybody's going to go, oh no, the safe space has been
Stalin
invaded.
apparently liked that statement.
It's a beautiful
It was
statement.
reported to him, and
Yes,
he agreed.
right. That's right. Maybe I'll bring Stanley's false promises and throw it down on the
Explodes
table.
many times.
Many times. Mike Davis's Prisoners of the American Dream, Labor History in the U.S., Race and Nation, right? Right. All right, so listen, let's pick up with the historicity. We'll go back to this. It's complicated, to say
good.
the least.
This is interesting.
And thank you, Chris, for,
Yeah. Thank
you very
reading
much.
that. And
That was good.
Yeah, it was good, very good, and I'm glad you read that. You read that more actively than the Heidegger, I bet, huh?
It helped me to
Yeah, I understand.
understand
It's good. No, I'm glad you did that. Very smart of you. Yeah.